Chilling tales for dark nights.
Want to make sure you never miss a Chilling Tales for Dark Nights video again? Be sure to subscribe and hit that bell to turn on notifications.
It started out like any other workday. I had houses to sell and people who wanted to buy them. Honestly, I've always found being a realtor embarrassingly easy. People seek you out and ask you to sell them incredibly high-ticket items. I've done other sales jobs, and you always have to talk the buyers into extras, into upgrades, all for a tiny commission. With houses, it's so much easier. Your customers walk in already prepared to sign their life away for the next 30 years, so it's easy to convince them to go for the nicer house, the better neighborhood, the higher price tag, the bigger commission, from my point of view. Obviously, it's not always completely smooth. I've had some real nightmare clients. Who hasn't? I've been yelled at, talked down to, insulted, even physically threatened on a couple of occasions, but 90% of my job was just about keeping a smile on my face and saying empty phrases like, "Okay, I hear you," or "Let's keep looking." Easy as pie. So I didn't expect this day to be anything out of the ordinary. Houses had been selling well lately, and I'd just gotten several new ones added to my roster. If I kept my numbers up, I was on track to have the most sales of the quarter, so I was pretty motivated to get out there and get folks into a new house. I usually like to do a walkthrough beforehand to make sure that there aren't any surprises, but I hadn't had a chance to do that with my upcoming afternoon showing. If I had, maybe it would have turned out a lot better for the Hubers. Then again, maybe it would have turned out a lot worse for me, so I don't know. The house looked fine from the outside. It was a California split level, a little under 2,000 square feet, a classy mix of brick and wood siding. The house and land were well maintained, and I could see that Mrs. Huber, Marilyn, was already charmed by it. It was within their price range in the school district they were looking for, and basically everything was just falling into place. I could smell an easy sale. I was going to be able to knock this one off on day one, and then it'd just be a matter of paperwork. I refrained from rubbing my hands together in glee as I walked the Hubers up to the front door, but only barely. That's how good I was feeling about this. Inside was great too, at least at first. Hardwood floors in the entry hall, big windows letting the whole place glow in the afternoon sun, nice neutral colors on the walls, and a pleasant smell in the air. It was picture-perfect staging, and the Hubers were eating it up. Irving was pointing out fancy features in the kitchen. Marilyn was talking about having people over for parties, and I just followed along pretending they needed me there. I didn't have to do a thing. The house was selling itself. Everything went perfectly right up until we were leaving. We'd finished touring the top floor, and they'd both gushed about how perfect the view from the master bedroom was. I was leading the way down the stairs, chatting over my shoulder with the Hubers and keeping one hand on the railing to guide myself along. I wasn't really paying much attention. How much attention does anyone ever pay to stairs? These were carpeted, they didn't squeak, and the wooden posts and railings were solid and attractive. They successfully connected the floors of the house. That's all you can really say about stairs. Suddenly, Marilyn broke into my patter. "Sorry, this is a strange question, but how many floors does this house have?" 3, including the finished basement," I told her, wondering why she was asking. We just finished walking through them all. "Right, that's what I thought. Only, this is the second flight of stairs, and we're still heading to the front hallway." I honestly had no idea what she meant at first. Obviously, it wasn't the second flight of stairs, or we would be on our way to the basement. These weren't the basement stairs. Therefore, we hadn't gone down 2 flights. I tried to think of a way to say, "You have not successfully counted to 1. That didn't sound patronizing or rude. Finding nothing, instead I said, "Well, we're here now, at least. We can..." I stopped dead on a small landing where the stairs made a right turn. It should have been just a couple more stairs to the entryway. Instead, I was looking at the hallway leading to the bedrooms. the one on the top floor of the house. I looked behind me. At the top of the stairs, I could see the hallway we'd just left. My mind lurched, trying to find some sense to seize onto. It was a 3-level house. I was at the base of some stairs. I could see other stairs ahead of me, leading down. Therefore, I must be on the middle level where the entryway was. It's just that I wasn't. I was on the top level, having taken stairs down to get there. "Something's wrong," I said stupidly. Irving and Marilyn reached out and held each other's hands. They looked around nervously. I realized that they were waiting for me to do something. I was in charge here, after all. Let's just take the stairs down," I suggested, suiting action to word. This time I kept my eyes focused ahead, watching every step. I could hear the Hubers walking behind me, their paired treads only a stair away. Ordinarily, I would have been annoyed to have a client stepping on my heels like that, but right now, I didn't blame them at all. 11 stairs down brought us to a right turn landing. With trepidation, I made the turn, hoping that somehow I just misunderstood something before, that I'd somehow failed to use stairs correctly. My hopes were dashed as I stepped out into the same carpeted hallway leading to the bedrooms. The ground floor was still somehow below us. The Hubers exchanged wide-eyed glances. "I don't understand this," said Marilyn. "Well, look," said Irving, trying to be reasonable. "If down doesn't work, maybe up will." He turned and began to walk back up the stairs. Struck by a sudden curiosity, I moved across the hall to look at the stairs leading down. Marilyn kept her position on the landing so she could see both of us. When the stairs came into view, I saw exactly what I'd feared. Although Irving had gone up the stairs behind me, I was now ahead of him on the floor he was climbing to. His face blanched when he saw me. This is impossible." He looked back at Marilyn below me. "How is this happening?" "I can see you," Marilyn called weakly to me. From both directions, I can see you at the top of the stairs," she pointed. "And at the bottom over here." She turned her head and gestured. Suddenly, feeling weak, I sat down against the wall, taking solace in its solidity. I closed my eyes and pressed my fingers to my temples, willing this all to be some sort of fever dream. "Are you all right?" Irving called. I heard his footsteps start toward me. He was only 4 or 5 steps from the top. Somehow, though, they kept going. I opened my eyes. Irving was climbing the stairs, a look of terror on his face. He scrambled faster and faster, yet he never moved forward. Marilyn screamed. I leapt to my feet. Behind Irving, the staircase was lengthening, adding a stair beneath his feet for every step he took. I lunged forward, my hand extended for him to grab, but as I reached for him, a dozen new stairs appeared, dragging him away from me. "Go back down!" I shouted. Irving turned and tried to run, but it was too late. The stairs stretched away at a frightening rate, a corridor reaching out to infinity. Irving was reduced to a tiny speck somewhere in the middle, and although I could hear Marilyn screaming behind me, I could also hear a tiny version echoing faintly up the walls of what had been the staircase in front of me. Less than a second later, the staircase snapped back into place, the same 11 steps there should have always been. Irving was gone. Marilyn was shrieking. She had collapsed onto the landing and was clinging to the railing like it was a lifeline. She sobbed Irving's name over and over, but there was no response. Her total breakdown helped bring me back to myself. I took her by the arm and attempted to tug her to her feet. "Mrs. Huber, Marilyn, come on, please. We have to get out of here." "How?" she wailed, a question for which I have no answer. I don't know. One of the rooms, maybe? There must be." I opened the door to one of the bedrooms. Fear gripped my stomach. The door now led to another set of stairs, or more probably, the same ones. Irving! Irving! Come on, that isn't helping. Let's try going down the stairs with our eyes closed. Maybe it's an illusion. That didn't make any sense, but it was all I could come up with. It was good enough for Marilyn, at least. She closed her eyes and, still clinging to my hand, allowed me to lead her to the stairs. Okay, here's the rail. Put your hand on it. I'm not going to let go of you, I assured her. Just hold the rail for safety. I'm going to have my eyes closed too. Ready? Stay close. Here we go. My right hand on the railing, my left hand bent awkwardly behind me, I shuffled forward and felt my way onto the first step. I stepped down and felt Marilyn moved into the position beside me. Step, step, down the stairs, one shuffling movement at a time. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, letting my feet guide me. Slow though I went, after a few steps, Marilyn began to fall behind. Come on, you've got to keep up. I'm trying. You're going too fast. I'm barely moving, I thought, but did not say. I bit my tongue and took another step. From behind me, I heard Marilyn's muffled footsteps hitting the carpeted stairs. Once, twice, 3 times. My left hand, still gripped tightly in her fist, began to get pulled slowly backward. Marilyn? Slow down, she begged me. You're getting too far ahead. Stop moving. Fully stationary, I risked opening my eyes. I saw what I already knew had to be true. Just as it had with Irving, the staircase was beginning to lengthen. Marilyn, I said, my voice catching in my throat. Her eyes popped open, widening in fear as she realized what was happening. Help me! Her palm started to slide through my grasp, and I did the only thing I could do. I pulled as hard as I could, yanking her off of the stairs and sending her tumbling onto me. We fell down the last 4 stairs together, crashing into the wall of the landing hard enough to crack the plaster. I saw stars and tasted blood. Shaking my head, I struggled to a standing position and found that I was now looking at the entryway, its gleaming wooden floors a shining beacon of hope. Marilyn was still sobbing on the ground, her arms wrapped around my leg. I'd like to believe that I wouldn't have bolted for the door and left her there in any case, but I certainly wasn't going to do it with the death grip she had on me. Marilyn, we made it. We're here. We can get out. She looked up, fearful and disbelieving. Come on, I coaxed, lifting her to her feet once more. Look, there's the door. We can go. But Irving! I know. We'll come back for him, I lied. There was no chance I was ever setting foot in that house again. We can get help. We've just got to go. I half dragged her to the door. I was certain that it was going to be another trick, that the hallway would begin to stretch or the outside door would open to more stairs, but I had no idea what else to do. When I opened the front door and it actually led to the outside, I burst into tears. Eyes streaming, I raced down the brick steps. Marilyn kept pace with me, both of us running as fast as we could until we collapsed against our cars, chests heaving. Her hair was wild, her knees were skinned, her blouse was torn. I was certain I looked no better. I could feel a painful wetness on the back of my head where I'd banged into that wall, but my hair seemed to be keeping most of the blood in place, and if that was what it took to get out of that nightmare, I counted it a small price to pay. We stared at each other for several minutes. My heart rate gradually slowed. My mind attempted to tell me that I couldn't have seen what I thought I had. It was a bright, sunny suburban day. Houses didn't unfold into impossible geometries, not in a nice neighborhood like this. If Irving had been there with us, I might have even convinced myself it was some sort of hallucination. But he wasn't. The house had him. "We have to go back in," Marilyn said, but her voice lacked conviction. I shook my head, eliciting a stab of pain. "No way. Sorry, no way." "But Irving's in there!" "We'll get him. We'll get help. We can, I don't know, tie a rope to the outside or make a human chain or something. Something. But we can't go back in there like this. I can't just leave him." "We'll come." My response was interrupted by a loud slam from the house. Our heads both jerked up to see the front door standing wide open. Irving stood in the door frame, gripping the edges like his life depended on it. He gave a cry that was half a yell of triumph and half a sob, and then he fell bonelessly down the brick steps to the pathway below. Marilyn and I raced over. Irving was in bad shape, and not just from the fall. His clothes were tattered and filthy. His hands were bloody and blistered. His hair was ragged. And although he had been clean-shaven when we stepped into the house, he had now what appeared to be several days' growth of beard. "Irving! Irv! Irv!" Marilyn cradled his head in her arms, but Irving did not move. I checked his pulse and was relieved to find it present. I let Marilyn attempt to wake him up for another minute, and then I took out my cell and called the 911. I lied to the dispatchers. I said he'd had some sort of an attack, that I thought maybe it was blood sugar related. I said his wife was here and would hopefully be calmed down enough when they arrived to give them better information. I gave them the address and told them we would meet them at the street. They said not to move him, and I told them that that was where he had collapsed. Then I hung up the phone so I could drag him to the curb. The open door of the house gaped mockingly behind me, challenging me to come back inside. It scared me to look into it, but it scared me more to have my back to it. So I simply got as far away as I could and waited for the EMTs. The ambulance took the Hubers away, leaving me alone. With no idea what else to do, I got into my car and drove back to the office. It wasn't even really a conscious decision. I was in shock and running on autopilot. I wandered into the office looking like I'd been mugged in the parking lot. I stumbled to my desk, ignoring my coworkers' questions, and fell into my chair. I stared at my reflection in the blank monitor as their chatter passed over my head. After a few minutes, a hand fell onto my shoulder. I looked up to see my coworker, Marianne. "What happened?" Him. There was an attack. He had an attack, Keeping her voice low, her eyes darting around to see who was listening, she asked, "Was it a house?" "What? A house? Did something go wrong in the house?" I stared at her dumbly. She pressed on. "Monsters, bent space, distortions of reality?" I nodded. "Okay, here." She passed me a business card, one from our agency. The name on it was Gray Michael. It wasn't anyone I knew. I started. Marianne frantically shushed me. "Do not say his name until you're ready to talk to him. Go get cleaned up first. Take a moment. Don't stumble into this." "Who is this?" She glanced furtively around again. "He's a coworker. He specializes in difficult houses. He can help you here." I looked around the office. It wasn't that large of a space. "Okay, but who is he?" "When you're ready, go out into the hallway. His office is right there." "I've never seen it." "You will once you say his name." Marianne moved off into the office, spreading a cover story about a client fainting and dragging me with him down some steps. I turned the card over in my hands a few times, then tucked it into my pocket and went to wash up. I wasn't wholly successful at getting all of the blood out of my hair, but by the time I was done, I looked fairly presentable and felt a whole lot more awake. My brain was working overtime, trying to convince me that I'd imagined the whole thing, that I'd fallen and hit my head and made the rest of it up. But there was still a 911 call in my recent calls log, and I knew that if I called the local hospitals, I'd be able to find out where the Hubers had been admitted pretty easily. I planted my hands on the bathroom counter and stared at myself in the mirror, trying to decide if I was looking into the eyes of a crazy person. In the end, I shrugged and turned away without an answer. "All right," I said to myself. "Let's go find Gray Michael." His office, as Marianne had said, was right there. The name was on a plaque on the door. It was impossible to miss, yet I'd somehow walk past it every day. I knocked lightly on the door. "Come in," called a mild voice. I opened the door and met Gray Michael. He was normal. Aggressively normal. If I told you to picture a generic white male, you'd be thinking of him. His smile was pleasant and professional, a perfect stock image look. He gestured to a chair in front of his desk. "Come in, close the door, have a seat. So, you have a problem." I followed his instructions. "How do you know I have a problem?" "You have my card," he said, as if that explained everything. "Tell me what happened." I started to speak, but he quickly held up one thin finger. "Not what you think happened, not what must have happened because what you remember can't possibly be true. Tell me what happened, in order, without apology or prevarication." Something in his voice made his words less of an instruction and more of an unassailable command. I opened my mouth and let the words fall out. When I had finished, Gray Michael nodded his head. "Simple enough." "Simple?" "Yes, this is small, a fledgling. One trick, very little power. Shall we go?" "Go where?" I was totally lost in this conversation. "To the house. To remove it." I started to refuse, but Gray Michael stood up from his desk and brushed invisible dust from his suit. "Drive. It will give you something to do." Without thinking, my keys were in my hand and I was heading for the door. We were out of the parking lot before I even realized he was riding in my passenger seat. "I can't go back in there," I told him. "You won't have to. Only one step, so that you can declare your request for assistance." "What?" "You need to say the following phrase, as exactly as you can. I, as the duly appointed representative tasked with the preservation of this home and its contents, hereby invite Gray Michael inside." Only he didn't say Gray Michael. His lips said Gray Michael. The sound said Gray Michael. But what I felt was something dark and broken, words of tortured malice. We passed the rest of the drive in silence. Gray Michael seemed content to watch the scenery while I was simply trying to calm my panicked brain. When we pulled up outside, the front door was closed. "I left that open," I told Gray Michael. "It's not important," he said, getting out of the car. "This will all be over soon." My courage failed me as I approached the front door. If it had still been open, I think I could have stepped inside. But to grasp the handle and open it myself was beyond me. I can't do this." Said Gray Michael. "Are you saying that you've wasted my time?" I took an immediate step backward from the look he gave me, banging my back against the house's front door. No! "Then open the door and invite me inside." I opened it without hesitation. My fear of the house hadn't lessened, but I'd found something I feared more. I took a single step inside. "That's far enough," said Gray Michael. "Now, invite me." I cleared my throat. "I, as the duly appointed representative tasked with the preservation of this home and its contents, hereby invite Gray Michael inside." His name twisted like burned rope in my throat. It felt like nails on bone, carving secret messages on my skeleton, words that would never leave me. "Thank you," he said, stepping past me into the house. "Now, please remain on the porch and hold this door closed. Do not open it for anything. It could be very dangerous for you if you do." He closed the door in my face. I took hold of the handle and exerted a gentle pull. I wondered how long I was going to have to stand like this, and what I would have to say to anyone who asked what I was doing. Those thoughts were driven from my mind when the screaming started. I jumped, nearly losing my grip on the door handle, but fear of Gray Michael kept me in place. The screams seemed to come from the house itself, as if the bricks and boards were crying out. They ranged up and down in pitch, sounding sometimes human, but always terrifying. Then the scratching started, desperate clawing against the door. I felt tugging against the handle, and I leaned my weight back, heedless of the steps behind me. Not for anything, Gray Michael had said, and I would not open it for anything. My blood ran cold as voices began pleading with me. Children, old folks, family members, they begged and cried to get out. I stood fast. They slowly died away. "Thank you," said Gray Michael from behind me. I spun around to find him standing at the bottom of the steps, not a hair out of place. "You can release the door now. The house has been cleansed." "What do we do now?" "By preference, you take me back to the office. You have a house to sell, after all, and I have other work to do." We were silent again on the drive back. At one point, he yawned. I glanced over and caught a glimpse into his mouth. It opened like a cave, distant lights glittering inside. He saw me watching and raised an eyebrow. I said nothing. We shook hands back at the office. "I'll be seeing you around," Gray Michael said. I've been trying not to think too hard about what that might mean. In the meantime, anyone looking to buy a house, I can guarantee with absolute certainty that it is not haunted. Gray Michael made sure of that.
On a blue afternoon in autumn, Riku and Miki drove south from Numatsu in his silver convertible along the coast of the Izu Peninsula. The temperature was mild for the end of October, and the air was clear, the sun glinting off the Suruga Bay. She wore sunglasses and, to protect her hair, a yellow scarf with a design of orange butterflies. He wore driving gloves, a black dress shirt, and a loosened white tie. The car, the open road, the rush of the wind made it impossible to converse, and so, for miles, she watched the bay to their right, and he the rising slopes of maple and pine to their left. Just outside the town of Dogoshima, a song came on the radio. Just you, just me. And they turned to look at each other. She waited for him to smile. He did. She smiled back. And then he headed inland to search for the hidden onsen in Ugami. They'd met the previous night at the Limit, an upscale hostess bar. Riku's employer had a tab there, and he was free to use it when in Numatsu. He'd been once before, drunk, and spent time with a hostess. Her conversation sounded rote, like a script, her flattery grotesquely opulent, and therefore flat. The instant he saw Miki, though, in her short black dress with a look of uncertainty in her eyes, he knew it would be a different experience. He ordered a bottle of Nika Yoichi and 2 glasses. She introduced herself. He stood and bowed. They were in a private room at a polished table of blonde wood. The chairs were high-backed and upholstered like thrones. To their right was an open-air view of pines and the coast. She waited for him to smile, and eventually he did. She smiled back and told him, "I'm writing a book." Riku said, "Aren't you supposed to tell me how handsome I am?" "Your hair's perfect," she said. He laughed. "I see." "I'm writing a book," she said again. "I decided to make a study of something." "Oh, you're a scientist," he said. "We're all scientists. We watch and listen, take in information, process it. We spin theories by which we live." "Well, what if they're false?" "What if they're not?" she said. He shook his head and took a drink. They sat in silence for a time. She stared out past the pines, sipping her whiskey. He stared at her. "Tell me about your family," said Riku. She told him about her dead father, her ill mother, her younger sister and brother. But when she inquired about his parents, he said, "Okay, tell me about your book." "I decided to study a season, and since autumn is the season I'm in, it would be autumn. It's a natural history of autumn." "You've obviously been to the university," he said. She shook her head. "No, I read a lot to pass the time between clients." "How much have you written?" "Nothing yet. I'm researching now, taking notes." "Do you go out to Thousand Tree Beach and stare at Fuji in the morning?" "Your sarcasm is intoxicating," she said. He filled her glass. "No, I do my research here. I ask each client what autumn means to him." "And they tell you?" She nodded. "Some just want to say how big their biceps are, but most sit back and really think about it. The thought of it makes all the white-haired Oji-sons smile, the businessmen cry, the young men a little scared. A lot of it is the same, just images, the colorful leaves, the clear, cold mornings by the bay, a certain pet dog, a childhood friend, a drunken night. But sometimes they tell me whole stories." "What kind of stories?" "A very powerful businessman. One of the other hostesses swore he was a master of the 5 elements. Once told me his own love story about a young woman he had an affair with. It began on the final day of summer, lasted only as long as the following season, and ended in the snow." "What did you learn from that story? What'd you put in your notes?" "I recorded his story as he told it, and afterward wrote, 'The story of a ghost.'" "Why a ghost?" he asked. "I forget," she said. And I lied. I attended Waseda University for 2 years before my father died. "Well, you didn't have to tell me," he said. "I knew when you told me you called the businessman's story the story of a ghost." "Pretentious?" she asked. "Eh," he shrugged. "Maybe," she said and smiled. "Forget about that," said Riku. "I will top that Make Inu businessman's exquisite melancholy by proposing a field trip." He sat forward in his chair and touched the tabletop with his index finger. "My employer recently rewarded me for a job well done and suggested I use, whenever I like, a private onsen he has an arrangement with down in Itsu. I need only call a few hours in advance." "A field trip?" she said. "What will we be researching?" "Autumn. The red and yellow leaves. The place is out in the woods on a mountainside, hidden and very old-fashioned, so no frills. I propose a dohan, an overnight journey to the onsen Inugami." "A date?" she said. "And our attentions will only be on autumn? Nothing else?" "You can trust me when I say that is entirely up to you." "Your hair inspires confidence," she said. "You can arrange things with the house on the way out." "I intend to be in your book," he said, and prevented himself from smiling. After hours of winding along the rims of steep cliffs and bumping down tight dirt paths through the woods, the silver car pulled to a stop in a clearing in front of a large, slightly sagging farmhouse, Micah style, built of logs with a thatched roof. 20 yards to the left of the place, there was a sizable garden filled with dying sunflowers, with 10-foot stalks, their heads bowed. To the right of the house, there was a slate path that led away into the pines. The golden, late afternoon light slanted down on the clearing, shadows beginning to form at the tree line. "We're losing the day," said Riku. "We'll have to hurry." Miki got out of the car and stretched. She removed her sunglasses and stood still for a moment, taking in the cool air. "I have your bag," said Riku, and shut the trunk. As they headed for the house, 2 figures appeared on the porch. One was a small old woman with white hair, wearing monpe pants and an indigo katazome jacket with a design of white flames. Next to her stood what Miki at first mistook for a pony. The sight of the animal surprised her and she stopped walking. Riku went on ahead. "Grandmother Chinatsu?" he said, and bowed.
"Your employer has arranged everything with me. Welcome,"
she said. A small wrinkled hand with dirty nails appeared from within the sleeve of the jacket. She beckoned to Miki.
"Come, my dear, don't be afraid of my pet Ono. He does not bite."
She smiled and waved her arm. As Miki approached, she bowed to Grandmother Chinatsu, who only offered a nod. The instant the young woman's foot touched the first step of the porch, the dog gave a low growl. The old lady wagged a finger at the creature and snapped, "Yumiti!" Then she laughed, low and gruff, the sound at odds with her diminutive size. She extended her hand and helped Miki up onto the porch. "Come in," she said, and led them into the farmhouse. Miki was last in line. She turned to look at the dog. Its coat was more like curly human hair than fur. She winced in disgust. A large, flattened pug face, no snout to speak of, black eyes, sharp ears, and a thick bottom lip, bubbling with drool. "Oh no," she said, and bowed slightly in passing. As she stepped into the shadow beyond the doorway, she felt the dog's nose press momentarily against the back of her dress. In the main room, there was a rock fireplace within which a low flame licked 2 maple logs. Above hung a large paper lantern, orange with white blossoms, shedding a soft light in the center of the room. The place was rustic, wonderfully simple. All was wood, the walls, the ceiling, the floor. There were 3 ancient carved wooden chairs gathered around a low table off in an alcove at one side of the room. Grandmother led them down a hallway to the back of the place. They passed a room on the left, its screen shut. At the next room, the old lady slid open the panel and said, "The toilet." Farther on, they came to 2 rooms, one on either side of the hallway. She let them know who was to occupy which by mere nods of her head. "The bath is at the end of the hall," she said. Their rooms were tatami style, straw mats and a platform bed with a futon mattress in the far corner. They undressed, put on robes and sandals, and met in the hallway. As they passed through the main room of the house, Ono stirred from his spot by the fireplace, looked up at them, and snorted. "Oh, easy, easy," said Riku to the creature. He stepped aside and let Miki get in front of him. Once out on the porch, she said, "Ono is a little scary." "Only a little?" he asked. Grandmother appeared from within the plot of dying sunflowers and called that there were towels in the shed out by the spring. Riku waved to her as he and Miki took the slate path into the pines. Shadows were rising beneath the trees, and the sky was losing its last blue to an orange glow. Leaves littered the path, and the temperature had dropped. The scent of pine was everywhere. Curlews whistled from the branches above. "Are you taking notes?" He called ahead to her. She stopped and waited for him. "Which do you think is more autumnal? The leaves, the dying sunflowers, or Grandmother Chinatsu?" "Too early to tell," he said. "I'm withholding judgment." Another 100 yards down the winding path, they came upon the spring nearly surrounded by pines except for one spot, with a view of a small meadow beyond. Steam rose from the natural pool, curling up in the air, reminding Miki of the white flames of the old lady's jacket. At the edge of the water, closest to the slate path, there was ancient stonework, a crude bench, a stacked rock wall covered with moss, 6 foot by 4, from which a thin waterfall splashed down into the rising heat of the onsen. "Lovely," said Miki. Riku nodded. She left him and moved down along the side of the spring. He looked away as she stepped out of her sandals and removed her robe, which she hung on a nearby branch. He heard her sigh as she entered the water. When he removed his robe, her face was turned away, as if she were taking in the last light of the meadow. Meanwhile, Riku was taking Miki in, her slender neck, her long black hair, and how it lay on the curve of her shoulder, and her breasts. "Are you getting in?" she asked. He silently eased down into the warmth. When Miki turned to look at him, she immediately noticed the tattoo on his right shoulder, a vicious swamp eel with rippling fins and needle fangs and a long body that wrapped around Riku's back. It was the color of the moss on the rocks of the waterfall. Riku noticed her glancing at it. He also noticed the smoothness of her skin, and her nipples were erect. "Who is your employer?" she asked. "He's a good man," he said, and lowered himself into a crouch so that only his head was above water. "Now, pay attention," he said, and looked out at the meadow, which was already in twilight. "To what?" she asked, also sinking down into the water. He didn't respond, and they remained immersed for a long time, just two heads floating on the surface, staring silently and listening, steam rising around them. At last light, when the air grew cold, the curlews lifted from their branches and headed for Australia. Riku stood, moved to a different spot in the spring, and crouched down again. Miki moved closer to him. A breeze blew through the pines. A cricket sang in the dark. "Was there any inspiration?" he asked. "I'm not sure," she said. "It's time for you to tell me your story of autumn." She drew closer to him, and he backed up a step. "I don't tell stories," he said. "As brief as you want, but something," she said, and smiled. He closed his eyes and said, "Okay. The autumn I was 17, I worked on one of the fishing boats out of Numatsu. We were out for horse mackerel. On one journey, we were struck by a rogue wave, a giant that popped up out of nowhere. I was on deck when it hit, and we were swamped. I managed to grab a rope, and it took all of my strength not to be drawn overboard. The water was so cold and powerful. I was sure I would die. 2 men did get swept away, and they were never found. That was my natural history of autumn." She moved forward and put her arms around him. They kissed. He drew his head back and whispered in her ear, "When I returned to shore that autumn, I quit fishing." She laughed and rested her head on his shoulder. They dined by candlelight in their robes in the alcove off the main room of the farmhouse. Grandmother Chinatsu served and Ono followed a step behind, so that every time she leaned forward to put a platter on the table, there was the dog's leering face, tongue drooping. The main course was thin slices of raw mackerel with grated ginger and chopped scallions. They drank sake. Miki remarked on the appearance of the mackerel after Riku's story. "Most definitely a sign," he said. They discussed the things they each saw and heard at the spring as the sake bottle emptied. It was well past midnight when the candle burned out, when they went down the hall to his room. 3 hours later, Miki woke in the dark, still a little woozy from the sake. Riku woke when she sat up on the edge of the bed. "Are you all right?" he asked. "I have to use the toilet." She got off the bed and lifted her robe from the mat. Slipping into it, she crossed the room. When she slid back the panel, a dim light entered. A lantern, hanging in the center of the hallway ceiling, bathed the corridor in a dull glow. Miki left the panel open and headed up the hallway. Riku lay back and immediately dozed off. It seemed only a minute to him before Miki was back, shaking him by the shoulder to wake up. She'd left the panel open, and he could see her face. Her eyes were wide, the muscles of her jaw tense, a vein visibly throbbing behind the pale skin of her forehead. She was breathing rapidly, and he could feel the vibration of her heartbeat. "Get me out of here," she said in a harsh whisper. "What's wrong?" he said, and moved quickly to the edge of the bed. She kneeled on the mattress next to him and grabbed his arm tightly with both hands. "We've got to leave," she said. He shook his head and ran his fingers through his hair. It wasn't perfect anymore. He carefully removed his arm from her grip and checked his watch. "It's 3 a.m., he said. "You want to leave?" "I demand that you take me out of this place, now." "What happened?" he asked. "Either you take me now or I will leave on foot." He gave a long sigh and stood up. I'll be ready in a minute," he said. She went across the corridor to her room and gathered her things together. When they met in the hallway, bags in hand, he asked her, "Do you think I should let Grandmother Chinatsu know we're leaving?" "Definitely not," she said, on the verge of tears. She grabbed him with her free hand and dragged him by the shirt sleeve down the hallway. As they reached the main room of the house, she stopped and looked warily around. "Was it the dog?" he whispered. The coast was apparently clear, for she then dragged him outside, down the porch steps to the silver car. "Get in," he said. "I have to put the top up. It's too cold to drive with it down." "Just hurry," she said, stowing her overnight bag. She slid into the passenger seat just as the car top was closing. He got in behind the wheel and reached over to latch the top on her side before doing his. Miki's window was down, and she heard the creaking of planks from the porch. She leaned her head toward her shoulder and looked into the car's side mirror. There, in the full moonlight, she could see Grandmother Chinatsu and Ono. The old lady was waving and laughing. "Drive!" she shrieked. Riku hit the start button, put the car in gear, and they were off into the night, racing down a rutted dirt road at 50. Once the farmhouse was out of sight, he let up on the gas. "You've got to tell me what happened," he said. She was shivering. "Just get us out of the woods first," she said. "To a highway?" "I can't see a thing. I don't remember all the roads," he said. "We might end up lost." He drove for more than an hour before he found a road made of asphalt. His car had been brutalized by the crude paths and branches jutting into the roadway. There would be 100 scratches on his doors. During that entire time, Miki stared ahead through the windshield, breathing rapidly. "We're on the main road. You want to tell me what happened?" he said. "I got up to use the toilet," she said. "And I did. But when I stepped back out into the hallway to return, I heard this horrible grunting noise. I swear it sounded like someone was choking Grandmother Chinatsu to death in her room. I moved alongside the wall to the entrance. The panel was partially open and there was a light inside. The noise had stopped, so I peered in. And there was the shriveled old lady on her hands and knees on the floor, naked. Her forearms were trembling. Her face was bright red, and she was croaking. At first, I thought she was ill, but then I looked up and realized she was engaged in sexual relations. "Grandmother Chinatsu?" he said and laughed. "Who was the unlucky gentleman?" "That disgusting dog!" She was doing it with Ono? "I almost vomited," said Miki. "But I could have dealt with it. The worst thing was Ono saw me peering in, and he smiled at me and nodded." "Dogs don't smile," he said. "Exactly," she said. "That place is haunted." "Well, I'll figure out where we are eventually, and we'll make it back to Numatsu by morning. I'm sorry you were so frightened. The field trip seemed a great success, till then." She took a few deep breaths to calm herself. "Perhaps that was the true spirit of autumn," she said. "A story of a ghost," he said. The silver car sped along in the moonlight. Miki was leaning against the window, her eyes closed. Riku thought he was heading for the coast. He took a tight turn on a narrow mountain road, and something suddenly lunged out of the woods at the car. He felt an impact as he swerved, turning back just in time to avoid the drop beyond the lane he'd strayed into. Miki woke at the impact and said, "What's happening?" I think I grazed a deer back there. I've got to pull over and check to see if the car's okay." Miki leaned forward and adjusted the rearview mirror so she could look out the back window. Too late to see. It was a half-mile back. He eased down on the brake, slowing, and began to edge over toward the shoulder. "There's something chasing us," she said. "I can see it in the moonlight. Keep going! Go faster!" He downshifted and took his foot off the brake. As he hit the gas, he reached up and moved the mirror out of her grasp so he could see what was following them. "It's a dog," he said. "Oh, but it's the fastest dog I ever saw. I'm doing 45 and it's gaining on us." They passed through an area where overhanging trees blocked the moon. "Watch the road," she said. When the car moved again into the moonlight, he checked behind them and saw nothing. Then they heard loud growling. Each searched frantically to see where the noise was coming from. Swerving out of his lane, Riku looked out his side window and down and saw the creature running alongside, the movement of its 4 legs a blur, its face perfectly human. "Kuso! Open the glove compartment! There's a gun in there! Give it to me!" "A gun? Hurry!" he yelled. She did as he instructed, handing him the sleek 9mm. "You were right," he said. "The place was haunted." He lowered his side window, switched hands between gun and wheel. Then, steadying himself, he hit the brake. The dog looked up as it sped past the car, a middle-aged woman's face, bitter, with a terrible underbite and a beauty mark beneath the left eye, riding atop the neck of a mangy gray mutt with a naked tail. As soon as it moved a foot ahead of the car, Riku thrust the gun out the window and fired. The creature suddenly exploded, turning instantly to a shower of salt. It had a face, he said, maneuvering the car out of its skid. A woman's face. "Don't stop," she said. "Please." "Don't worry." "Now," she said, "who is your employer? Why would he send you to such a place?" Maybe if I tell you the truth, it'll lift whatever curse we're under. What is the truth? My employer is a very powerful businessman, and I have heard it said that he is also an onmyoji. You know him. In a moment of weakness, he told you a story about an affair he had. Afterward, he worried that you might be inclined to blackmail him. If the story got out, it would be a grave embarrassment for him both at home and at the office. He told me, spend time with her. They wanted me to judge what type of person you are. And if I'm the wrong kind of person, I'm to kill you and make it look like an accident, he said. Are you trying to scare me to death? You and the old woman? No, I swear. I'm as frightened as you are. And I couldn't harm you. Believe me, I know you would never blackmail him. She rested back against the car seat and closed her eyes. She could feel his hand grasp hers. Do you believe me? He said. In the instant she opened her eyes, he saw ahead through the windshield 2 enormous dogs step onto the highway 30 yards in front of the car. Watch out! She screamed. He'd been looking over at her. He hit the brake before even glancing to the windshield. The car locked up and skidded, the headlights illuminating 2 faces. A man with a thin, black mustache and wire-framed glasses, whose mouth was gaping open, and a little girl, chubby, with black bangs, tongue sticking out. On impact, the front of the car crumpled, the airbags deployed, and the horrid dogs burst into salt. The car left the road and came to a stop on the right-hand side, just before the tree line. Riku remained conscious through the accident. He undid his seatbelt and slid out of the car, brushing glass off his shirt. His forehead had struck the rearview mirror, and there was a gash on his right temple. He heard growling, and, pushing himself away from the car, he headed around to Miki's side. A small, pot-bellied dog with the face of an idiot, sunken eyes and swollen lower lip was drooling and scratching at Miki's window. Riku aimed, pulled the trigger, and turned the monstrosity to salt. He opened the passenger door. Miki was just coming around. He helped her out and leaned her against the car. Bending over, he reached into the glove compartment and found an extra clip for the gun. As he backed out of the car, he heard them coming up the road, a pack of them, speeding through the moonlight, howling and grunting. He grabbed her hand and they made for the tree line. "Not the woods," she said, and tried to free herself from his grasp. "No, there's no place to hide on the road. Come on!" They fled into the darkness beneath the trees, Riku literally dragging her forward. Low branches whipped their faces and tangled Miki's hair. Although ruts tripped them, they miraculously never fell. The baying of the beasts sounded only steps behind them. But when he turned and lifted the gun, he saw nothing but night. Eventually, they broke from beneath the trees onto a dirt road. Both were heaving for breath, and neither could run another step. She'd twisted an ankle and was limping. He put one arm around her to help her along. She was trembling. So was he. "What are they?" she whispered. "Jinmenken," he said. "Haha, impossible." They walked slowly down the road, and, stepping out from beneath the canopy of leaves, the moonlight showed them, 100 yards off, a dilapidated building with boarded windows. "I can't run anymore," he said. "We'll go in there, find a place to hide." She said nothing. They stood for a moment on the steps of the place, a concrete structure, some abandoned factory or warehouse, and he tried his cell phone. "No reception," he said, after dialing 3 times and listening. He flipped to a new screen with his thumb and pressed an app icon. The screen became a flashlight. He turned it forward, held it at arm's length, and motioned with his head for Miki to get close behind him. With a gun at the ready, they moved slowly through the doorless entrance. The place was freezing cold and pitch black. As far as he could tell, there were hallways laid out in a square with small rooms off to either side. "An office building in the middle of the woods?" she said. Each room had the remains of a Western-style door at its entrance, pieces of shattered wood hanging on by the hinges. When he shone the phone's light into the rooms, he saw a window opening boarded from within by a sheet of plywood and an otherwise empty concrete expanse. They went down one hall and turned left into another. Miki remembered she had the same app on her phone and lit it. Halfway down that corridor, they found a room whose door was mostly intact but for a corner at the bottom where it appeared to have been kicked in. Riku inspected the knob and whispered, "There's a lock on this one." They went in, and he locked the door behind them and tested its strength. "Get in the corner, under the window," he said. "If they find us and the door won't hold, I can rip off the board above us and we might be able to escape outside." She joined him in the corner and they sat, shoulders touching, their backs against the cold concrete. "We're sure to be safe when the sun rises." He put his arm around her and she leaned into him. Then neither said a word or made a sound. They turned off their phones and listened to the dark. Time passed, yet when Riku checked his watch, it read only 3:30. Well, that in a half hour? He wondered. Then there came a sound, a light tapping, as if rain was falling outside. The noise slowly grew louder, and seconds later, it became clear that it was the sound of claws on the concrete floor. That light tapping eventually became a clatter, as if 100 of the creatures were circling impatiently in the hallway. A strange, guttural voice came from the holes at the bottom corner of the door. "Tomodachi," it said. "Let us in." Riku flipped the flashlight app and held the gun up. Across the room, the hole in the bottom of the door was filled with a fat, pale, bearded face. One eye was swollen shut, and something oozed from the corner of it. The forehead was too high to see a hairline. The thing snuffled and smiled. "Shoot," said Miki. Riku fired, but the face flinched away in an instant. And once the bullet went wide and drilled a neat hole in the door, the creature returned and said, "Tomodachi." "What do you want?" said Riku, his voice cracking.
"We are hunting the spirit of the living," said the creature, the movements of its lips out of sync with the words it spoke. "What have we done?" said Miki. "Oh, our hunger is great. But we only require one spirit. We only take what we need. The other person will be untouched. One spirit will feed us for a week." Miki stood up and stepped away from Riku. He also got to his feet. "What are you doing?" she said. "Shoot them." She quickly lit her phone and shone it on him. Instead of aiming the gun at the door, he aimed it at her. "I'm not having my spirit devoured," he said to her. "You said you couldn't hurt me." "It won't be me hurting you," he said. She saw there were tears in his eyes. The hand that held the gun was wobbling. "I'm giving you the girl," he called to the Jinmenkin. "Oh, true benefactor," said the face at the hole. "No," she said. "What have I done?" "I'm going to shoot her in the leg so she can't run. Then, I'm going to let you all in. You will keep your distance from me, or I'll shoot. I have an extra clip, and I'll turn as many of you to salt as I can before you get to me." Turning to Miki, he said, "I'm so sorry. I did love you. But you're a coward. You don't have to shoot me in the leg," she said. "I'll go to them on my own. My spirit's tired of this world." She moved forward and gave him a kiss. Her actions disarmed him, and he appeared confused. At the door, she slowly undid the lock on the knob. Then, with a graceful, fluid motion, she pulled the door open and stepped behind it, against the wall. "Take him!" he heard her call. The Jinmenkin bounded in, dozens of them, small and large, stinking of rain, slobbering, snapping, clawing. He pulled the trigger till the gun clicked empty and the room was filled with smoke and flying salt. His hands shook too much to change the clip. One of the creatures tore a bloody chunk from his left calf and he screamed. Another went for his groin. The face of Grandmother Chinatsu appeared before him and devoured his. The following week, in a private room at the Limit, Miki sat at a blonde wood table, staring out the open panel across the room at the pines and the coast. Riku's employer sat across from her. "Ingenious. The natural history of autumn," he said. "And you knew this would draw him in?" She turned to face the older man. "He was a unique person," she said. "Too bad for Riku," he said. "I wanted to trust him. Really, the lengths to which you'll go to test the spirit of those you need to trust. He's gone because he was a coward. A coward I can tolerate. But he said he loved you, and it proved he didn't understand love at all. A dangerous flaw." He took an envelope from within his suit jacket and laid it on the table. "A job well done," he said. She lifted the envelope and looked inside. A cold breeze blew into the room. "You know," he said, "this season always reminds me of our time together." As she spoke, she never stopped counting the bills. "All I remember of that," she said, "is the snow."
You know, I used to laugh at the idea of being vegetarian. The idea of purposely not eating meat used to sound so dumb to me. I mean, yeah, healthy lifestyle and all. And yes, I'm aware that some people actually can't eat meat because of an inability to digest it. But come on, how could you say no to a nice full rack of baby back ribs or a quarter-pounder New York-style steak, right? Well, guess the joke's on me now. After what happened, I can't think of any of that without wanting to puke. I'm gonna put this out there now. If you're faint of heart or weak of stomach, do not listen to this. Let me also go ahead and say that no, I'm not talking about Mickey D's either. Say what you want about their food not being actual meat or whatever. I guarantee you, whatever it is made of, it's far less horrific than what I saw at the place I used to work at. Mr. Pigsley's Diner, home of delicious meat, happy bellies, and having a snorting good time. Those words, the big, bold red words plastered next to that smiling, fat-ass pig with a 50-style football jacket and haircut, will always haunt my nightmares. The place itself was one of those that was made to resemble an old-timey diner from the 50s and 60s. Black and white tiled floor, vintage photos from car shows, old stuntmen, or shots of Elvis Presley, as well as different antiques on display. The place even had an actual jukebox, coin-operated with actual CDs instead of the touchscreen ones you see nowadays. In the middle of the diner area was where the bar was. During the day, until about 6 o'clock or so, it was an ice cream bar, with the barley sodas being brought out later on in the evenings. I remember how you could bring your kid up to the bar on a Friday afternoon for a little oinkers hour, where the ice cream was handmade right in front of them, and they'd get whatever flavor and toppings they wanted, and however much of it they wanted for free. Aside from this, they also had the Piglet Wall of Fame, where the Rugrats would have pictures taken of them in little pig masks with the mascot, Mr. Pigsley, standing beside them as they scarfed down a 3-ounce plate of pulled pork. Of course, the kids loved it, and the parents loved it too for how dirt cheap the food was. We're talking $15 tops for a large-sized barbecue plate with 2 large sides with drink. I say all of this to say that the place was very family-oriented, particularly when it came to bringing the kids. My family actually used to take me and my brother Andre when we were kids, and like I said, with all the other kids, we too had more than our fair share of little oinker hours on Fridays to kick off the weekend, and had our pictures added to the Wall of Fame, which are all now gone, after what's happened. Now, take that and fast forward to almost a year ago. I'm 21 and having just moved out of my parents' house with no degree or any other job experience, and I needed to have a way to make rent for my apartment. And you can imagine how difficult a decision it was for me to choose Mr. Pigsley's Diner as my go-to. I was hired almost on the spot after I'd put in an application to be a cook. The pay for the job I'd be doing admittedly wasn't quite as bad as I was expecting. $11 an hour, 40 hours a week. Of course, being that it was strictly second shift, this meant long, exhausted nights slaving in the kitchen, and then closing the kitchen. It was rough, but I had to do it, and after about a month or two, I'd just gotten used to it. Actually, it wasn't long after that I was getting my first raise to $11.75 an hour. I had also managed to get to a point, usually because the other kitchen staff were out back taking a smoke, that I was actually able to handle work in most areas of the kitchen alone. In other words, I'd gotten pretty good at my job pretty quickly. One of my duties, unfortunately, was washing any remaining dishes at night when we were closed. It sucked, mostly because of the fact that it was always the grill utensils and shit that I got stuck washing. You know, the shit that'd be the dirtiest. And we had to wait until we were closed for the night to wash them. Because of this, and because the shift manager Trish usually dragged her feet with her part, making sure everything is done and done right, as well as the fact that the closing shift only had 2 people around to shut the place down for the night, we weren't usually getting out of there till about 1 or 1:30 in the morning every night. Well, it was because of this that things would take a weird turn. Funny enough, I almost didn't even notice it. It was a Friday night, which of course meant we'd been slammed all day with business, and I was beyond tired and ready to be done with the place for the night. I was in the sink room, located a little ways behind the kitchen and grill area next to the freezer and dry stock, washing the dishes, as best I could anyway, while Trish finished up with the money. Since my phone was dead, I couldn't listen to music or podcasts while I washed dishes like I usually did. That was when I heard it. It was very faint, and again, I almost didn't hear it. It almost sounded like a faint groaning noise. But being exhausted and figuring that it was just the electrical hum of the freezer, I shook it off and continued. It was when I was just about finished with the dishes, though, that I heard it again, louder. Listening a little harder, I noticed that it was indeed coming from the freezer. I pressed my ear to the door, and I could hear it much louder. Concentrating, I thought I could hear the sounds of muffled sobbing coming from inside. I tried pulling the handle to open the freezer door, only to find it locked. Weird, I thought. Why's the freezer locked? I was never told before that the freezer was supposed to be locked at night. Maybe it's to keep the meat fresh? To keep everything cold? This didn't make much sense to me, but I ended up having to just go with that when I heard Trish calling for me, telling me she was ready to go home. I pretty much immediately forgot all about it until the next night, closing the kitchen, when I heard it again. Like last time, the freezer door was locked, and inside, I could hear a very faint sound like someone was groaning. It was a lot louder this time. I also noticed that this time it seemed like it would randomly let out sharp bursts of crying or wailing. At one point, I thought I could hear a shrill sort of screaming noise as well. What the? I started knocking on the freezer door. Hello? Hey, is someone in there? Nothing. The only response was the continued groaning noises from the other side. I tried knocking again.
What's going on?
I spun around to see Trish standing behind me looking confused.
What the hell are you doing? Have you finished yet?
Yeah. I looked at the freezer. Hey, is there any particular reason the freezer's locked? She cocked her eyebrow.
What do you mean?
I pulled on the handle to demonstrate. Her eyes continued looking confused as she tried to open it herself with the same result.
Huh,
she said, resigning.
That is weird. No, I don't know why the heck they'd have it like this. What has you so worried about it, though?
Well, I thought I could hear something, or somebody in there.
What do you mean?
She asked, looking even more confused now. I shrugged and chuckled nervously. I don't know. I just keep hearing this weird noise coming from in there. I pressed my ear to the door again, still hearing that faint groaning sound. Do you hear it? Still looking skeptical, she then pressed her ear to the door. She stayed like this for a moment before shaking her head.
Sounds the same as it always has. At least same as it has since I've been here. This is an old place, though. The wiring in there must be on the fritz.
You sure? I asked, cocking my own eyebrows in confusion. 'Cause it sounds like someone's in there.
Yeah, and besides which, we can't get in there anyways. Now, I don't know about you, but I kinda like to get home before it's time to open the place back up.
She held up her phone, reading almost 1:45 a.m. With that, I gave one last look to the freezer before turning and following Trish. That night, I couldn't shrug it off like I did before. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop imagining something or someone in the freezer. Moreover, I couldn't stop wondering about what that sound was. Obviously, I wasn't buying the whole just the old faulty wiring crap. What the hell were they doing in there? As it happened, the next day was when the owner, Mr. Pigsley, would be in for his little routine visits. He usually would come once or twice a month, unannounced, and just sort of check in, you know? Make sure everyone's doing everything that needs to get done. Basically, sort of general inspection, you know? One thing I noticed, too, was that one of the first things he always did was to check out the freezer. Naturally, I figured if anything was going on in there, he'd know, right? As well as this, we were actually slow for the first time that week, by the way, which made it relatively easy for me to ask him about it first thing when he came in. "What do you mean?" he asked me, cocking his eyebrows like Trish did. "The past 2 nights, sir, I've been hearing these weird noises coming from the freezer. Whenever I go to try and check it out, though, it's always locked. Is it supposed to be?" He frowned. "What sort of noises?" I don't really know, sir," I replied, admittedly feeling a bit awkward. "It sounds like someone's in there." He stared, frowning at me for a moment before opening the freezer and walking inside. I followed him. Inside, of course, I heard the droning of the refrigeration system. In other words, the normal sounds it should have been making in there. And there were boxes labeled fresh meat stacked against the walls. Everything was there, just the way it was supposed to be. No weird sounds, nobody else in the freezer, aside from me and Mr. Pigsley. "Well," he said, turning back to me, "I don't hear nothing." He looked back inside for a moment before saying, "Okay, nothing except for the fridge wires on the last legs. I reckon I have to get that looked at, won't I?" He chuckled when he said this before saying, "Thanks for letting me know." I stood for a moment, confused, before stammering, Yes, sir, sure thing." I then felt the hand of Andy, one of the other grill hands, tap me on the shoulder, telling me I was needed back in the kitchen. Mr. Pigsley waved his hand dismissively before turning and going back into the freezer. Fridge wires on their last legs? I couldn't take my mind off how wrong that sounded to me. For one thing, the fridge actually sounded normal. Plus, after taking a peek at the thermostat outside, I saw that, at least according to the reading at the time, it was working just fine. Secondly, this didn't make sense to me because if they really were on their last legs, shouldn't he have known that and done something long before now? On top of all that, though, was the fact that the big question wasn't even answered. Why the hell was the freezer door locked? Not only this, how was it locked? There were no bolts or anything on the handle, inside or out. As much as I wanted to shove all this at Mr. Pigsley until I got an answer, I wouldn't get the opportunity again before he left. That night, I wasn't the one to close the kitchen, having agreed to switch shifts with Andy so he could get a few more hours in. For some reason, he was only scheduled 2 days that week for 5 hours each. This meant I was getting off that night at around 10 o'clock. Because I was still skeptical, or rather suspicious, about the whole freezer thing, I asked him as part of the agreement if he'd keep an eye on the freezer and to tell me if he noticed anything off about it. He agreed, though I could tell he thought I was nuts. So 10 o'clock rolled around and I was punching the clock, but not before checking the freezer one last time. It was unlocked, full of nothing but frozen food. I was heading out back to my car when I heard a rustling sound coming from the dumpster. Looking over, I could see the lid pushing up, like something was trying to get out. I was about to brush it off as probably just raccoons or maybe a couple of stray cats, when I then heard what sounded like snorting. What the fuck? I was cut off when I then heard a high-pitched squealing sound that almost seemed to echo in the empty parking lot. This caused my heart to skip about 3 or 4 beats, and I had to close my eyes and cover my ears tight. This was followed by several loud banging noises coming from inside the dumpster. I watched this continue, jaws slacked, frozen in shock, until the lid of the dumpster suddenly flew open. For a brief moment, I saw what looked like 2 pig ears slowly emerge from the dumpster, followed by 2 dark, empty, marble-looking eyes glinting into the streetlights. That was when I took off like a bat out of hell and bolted back around to the front of the diner and ran inside. "Guys!" I shouted, crashing through the front doors. They immediately looked at me wide-eyed and startled. I struggled to speak, being out of breath. There's something out there." "Where?" Andy asked. I pointed to the back and said, breathless, At the dumpster." His face immediately fell into one that said,
You're shitting me here, right?
I caught my breath as Trish asked what exactly it was that I saw. I began, remembering those 2 black, beady eyes glaring at me. "I think it was a pig."
A pig?
Trish asked, her voice completely bewildered now. Andy stared at me for a second before scoffing. "Dude," he said, sounding like he was 2 seconds away from busting his gut laughing in my face.
"Whatever shit you're on."
"I'm serious," I shouted, cutting him off. He just kept looking at me like I was crazy while Trish just looked lost. "I saw 2 pig eyes staring at me from the dumpster. I heard it squealing too."
Where the hell could it have come from?
Trish asked.
There's no farm around here.
Andy snickered and remarked,
Maybe the truck had one that wasn't quite ready yet.
Trish snickered at this too. I was the only one, though, that wasn't finding this funny. "Damn it, Andy, I'm not screwing around here. I saw a giant pig staring at me in the dumpster." He just snickered again.
"Oh, it was a giant pig."
He then made a surprised face and turned to Trish saying,
"Hear that, Trish? A mean old monster pig is gonna get us. Ooh."
I curled my hand into a fist, clenching my teeth. I was getting really agitated really quickly. Before I could do or say anything, though, I heard something coming from the back behind the kitchen, near the freezer.
"What?"
Trish asked, noticing my attention towards the back of the diner. I shushed her before starting towards the freezer. "Listen," I whispered. It sounded like something big was dragging its feet across the floor. "You hear that?" I watched Trish and Andy cup their ears, listening closer. I could also hear the sound of someone's muffled bawling in the distance, sounding like their mouth was covered or taped over. I watched as Trish seemed to take notice.
"What the hell is that?"
she asked, turning now to look towards the back like I was. Andy just looked at the both of us, confused.
"Now you too, Trish? What are you guys going on about?"
He stopped when he heard the sound of the freezer door opening. Now his eyes were wide.
"The fuck? Who's back there?"
We heard the freezer door shut, still hearing the muffled screaming from behind. Andy started towards the back when I shot out my hand, stopping him. "Wait, What if it's some maniac with a gun or something? He pushed past me towards the back. I followed after him with Trish joining behind me. The sounds from the freezer were louder now, shrill, like someone was being tortured. I could hear what sounded like a young girl, high school age, screaming, "No, please don't. Let me go." These were followed by sharp cries of pain that caused the three of us to have to cover our ears. As well as this, I could hear what sounded like a combination of growling and squealing mixed in with the screaming, sounding deep and gruff. We quickly darted the rest of the way to the freezer and began trying to open it. It was no use, however. It was somehow locked again. Even with all three of us pushing on the door at the same time, trying to force it open, it would not budge. As we were doing this, the sounds, both of the screaming and the weird squealing, got louder and louder. I began imagining the thing on the other side to be some sort of mutant behemoth pig monster, like Andy said, with huge muscular arms and gigantic tusks that could impale me like a kebab. Finally, Andy ran and got the emergency fire extinguisher and used it to batter the door until we heard something fall to the ground, crashing on the other side before shoving the door open. In front of the door was a bunch of the fresh meat boxes that apparently had been propped against the door to keep it shut. Now knocked over onto the floor of the freezer, I saw that a few of them had broke open, scattering red, meaty, bloody chunks all across the floor of the freezer. For just a brief second, I looked closely at a pile of the stuff, and that was all it took to make me start to retch. There, spilling out of a box, was what looked to be a large intestine, coiling out from the severed legs of what looked to be a small child, possibly even an infant. Almost on a sort of cue, the smell of a dead body flooded my nose instantly, further causing my stomach to turn over on itself. I wasn't the only one struggling to keep from spilling their stomach either. Seeing this, Andy had to cover his mouth and turn away. To her credit, funny enough, given how she always claimed to hate scary movies in the past when I talked about them, Trish was the only one who wasn't affected by this. At least, not as much as me and Andy. She took the lead and went on inside. It took another second of pulling ourselves together before me and Andy could follow her inside. We could all hear the sounds of screaming and pigs squealing from the far end of the freezer. Slowly, the three of us made our way towards the back, towards the sound. Despite what I said earlier about Trish being the most strong-stomached out of the three of us, what we saw next made her vomit right there in the freezer where she stood. There, in the middle of the floor, was a young girl. Couldn't have been a day over 17. Pinned to the floor, naked, and on top of her was a giant, hairy, overweight gorilla of a man, wearing what looked like one of those pig masks you'd see from Party City on Halloween. The pig man stopped when he must have heard Trish and reared up from the girl before turning to look at us. For a second, we all just stood there, me and Trish both speechless with horror, while Andy was the first to speak.
"Who are you? And what the fuck are you doing?"
Whatever just stood, snorting angrily, like he was raring up to charge at Andy. Trish ran over to try and help the girl when she was snatched by the throat and hurled into a stack of meat boxes behind her. I ran to help her up while Andy charged towards the pig man. Just like Trish, Andy was caught by the throat before being forced to the ground. After helping Trish up, she ran again to help the girl up while I tried to help Andy. Pig man had him on the ground, crushing his throat and pressing one knee on his chest, crushing his ribs. Without thinking, I hurled myself at him, shoving him off of Andy and into the wall to the right of us. Andy was wheezing and gasping for air as I helped him to his feet while Trish rushed her and the girl out of the freezer.
Call the police!
I shouted to her as she ran out. When I looked to where Pigman landed, I saw that the mask had fallen off. Now against the wall, buck-ass nude, was Mr. Pigsley.
What the?
Before I could even finish that thought, he looked up at me, glaring, before letting out a deafening squeal and charging at me. In less than seconds, he was on top of me, ravenously trying to bite at my face like a rabid dog. I tried pushing his face away, which resulted in 3 of my fingers getting bitten, hard enough to start bleeding and go numb. Andy tried wrestling him off of me by getting him in a chokehold, only to be met with a backhand that sent him flying into the wall again. Now he was crushing my throat like he was with Andy. My vision started blurring when the next thing I knew, I felt Mr. Pigsley's hands release my throat, causing me to gasp for air. Mr. Pigsley was on the ground, staring up at the ceiling, dazed, with Andy holding one of the boxes that he had used to bash him over the head with.
You okay?
He asked, breathless.
Yeah.
I groaned, pain still shooting through my hand. I could hear Mr. Pigsley's groan as he stirred on the floor. I told Andy to stay there and to make sure he didn't go anywhere while I went to check up on Trish. Sure enough, Trish and the girl were out front, talking to a couple of police officers. I joined them, and they asked me where he was. I led them back to the freezer where Mr. Pigsley was still writhing on the floor. The officers then took over, leading us back out to the front. By that time, the parking lot was filled with police cars and an ambulance. After checking them out with the ambulance, the other officers escorted Andy, Trish, and the girl home while I was checked out for my hand. I actually had to be taken to the hospital for it to get stitches. I read a few days after that, upon looking into the contents of the freezer, the mutilated remains of infants, as well as several teenagers, was found with evidence that they were being ground up and processed using the meat grinder next to the dry stock area in the back. Mr. Pigsley was arrested and tried for kidnapping, unable to link him to any of the human remains at the time. He claimed, though, that he had absolutely no idea what was going on, that apparently he was at his house one moment and lying naked in the freezer the next. In the end, he was sentenced to 3.5 years in a psychiatric facility. The diner was closed down and condemned after that, and a month later, it was cleared out and bulldozed, now serving as a vacant parking lot. I lost all contact with Trish and Andy, as well as anyone else from Mr. Pigsley's diner, and got a new job as a sales associate at a thrift store, where I work nowadays. The pay isn't as much as the hours are long, sure, but my co-workers are pretty cool. Plus, at least I don't have to work around food anymore. It was sometime last week that I was scrolling around online, just screwing around on my break at work, that I found old articles about local sightings of the Pigman. I clicked on them and read about multiple reports of people, namely teens and their small children, going missing in the dead of night in the town located just next to mine. Each time, a few witnesses would claim to see a giant creature with the head of a pig and the body of a man lurking around. Of course, these were usually the tinfoil hat types making these claims, so it didn't surprise me that these claims weren't exactly taken seriously by authorities at the time. That said, they never found any suspects, nor were the missing persons ever found. But the worst part, the thing that has now driven me to have constant nightmares, was when I looked at the dates of the reports. They were all dated in the early 50s, right around the same time that the diner first opened its doors. All that time, I, as well as God knows how many others, were eating children. What's even worse, I, for almost a year, was the one that cooked and served it to people. This is why I've decided two things. First, I will never work in another food establishment again. No exception. The second is that I'm strictly a vegetarian. It was admittedly a bit hard at first. Like I said, how could you pass up a nice juicy prime rib? But anytime I think about meat of any kind, I can't help but remember what I saw in the freezer that night.
One. The Gift. On my 8th birthday in 1968, I got an odd birthday gift. I was certain everything it represented was true, and I was quick to ask it questions as I awaited the triangular answer to appear in its purplish blue form underneath its black round body. The magic 8-ball, about the size of a softball, somehow held the magic to predict my future in simple answers to only yes and no questions. It is decidedly so. Ask again later. Better not tell you now. Cannot predict now. It is certain. You may rely on it. There were 20 possible answers, 10 affirmative, 5 non-committal, and 5 negatives. I was no mathematician, but the odds always seemed good that I should receive the answer I hoped for. For the most part, though, those hopeful answers usually eluded me. Trina wasn't in love with me. I wasn't going to get that mini bike like my best friend Randy got. I would also be forced to finish my school career without escaping by writing a #1 bestseller or be discovered on the junior high baseball diamond to become a professional pitcher. I never put stock in the negative answers, but held strong prospects for the positive ones. If I would have had money, I would have bet it all at my young age on what the 8-ball had to say. As I continued to grow up, like all toys purchased and given to me as birthday gifts, my once prized magic 8-ball finally found its home retired to the brown cardboard box filled with other short-lived Hasbro games and metal collectible cars once garnering my unrelenting attention, however short it was. I didn't see the magic 8-ball for many years as that box remained in the farthest reach underneath my bed where all monsters lived, only to come out at night to make their scary sounds and create many moments that rattled throughout the night. 2. Summer of 1978. I dreaded going through my things, an eclectic collection of my life getting laid out across my bed to either be taken with me off to school or packed away and taken to the basement. My folks were excited about me choosing creative writing as a major with journalism as a minor. My mom always loved writing. She was a published poet, and my grandmother on her side had written a 2-volume book on her life and times. It seemed possible the gift of writing was in my genes. My grandfather on her side was a preacher and gave what I recall very deep and thought-out words of wisdom filled with faith. I had chosen the small college in our hometown to attend. It hadn't made the list of schools turning out winning war correspondents like Neil Sheehan or novelists such as J.D. Salinger or Ernest Hemingway, but it was a chance for a kid from an average blue-collar family fighting to keep their house payment made and food on the table for 6 kids, a chance to break the mold and get a diploma from a good, solid college. In the middle of those nerve-wracking thoughts of my future while sorting out things of my past, I got down on my knees to survey the collection of forgotten junk kept hidden from sight underneath the bed I'd spent sleeping on since I can remember. In the farthest reach of the corner, swallowed by the darkest shadows, sat a dusty brown cardboard box, tucked away like a pirate's chest full of booty. I stretched my arm as far as possible, attempting to contact its edge using the tips of my fingers. I eased closer, my body now halfway underneath the frame of the bed until the feel of gritty, dry cardboard finally met the touch of my skin. I slid in a tad farther before a firm grip was made. Slowly backing out and tugging the slightly weighty box along with me, each elbow digging into the carpet, aiding in pushing myself backwards from the tight opening. I wondered what was contained inside. When I finally sat kneeling at the edge of my bed, I lifted the newly found treasure using both hands and held it up in the light. I inhaled a large breath of air and then in one strong puff blew the loose dust from its folded closed top. One flap held over the other which had sealed it shut. I should have known its contents, I supposed, but I didn't. Every child has a special hiding place for secret things, and I imagined this must have been mine, although I didn't recall having it. I placed the discovery on top of my bed amongst the other piles of things from my past to further inspect. Carefully pulling at one corner of the box, gently tugging at the focal point where the flaps overlapped, the box unfolded, mimicking the lens of a camera's aperture, opening its exposure ever wider. My attention became very focused while I attempted to recall the items that I had placed within its confinement so many years ago. I believe my heart rate even increased, slightly above normal as the opening became wide enough to clearly see inside. My smile grew exponentially across my face as my mind, now captured by a cascade of flooding memories, overwhelmed at what my eyes now saw and recognized. Sitting in the left-hand corner of the box, mixed amongst scattered Hot Wheels and Matchbox cars, sat my very dangerous set of clackers. The mere sight of the rock-hard, brightly colored red plastic balls leashed together by a thin white rope quickly brought the painful memory of swollen wrists painted with blackened bruises, ushering in tears as large as the magic 8-ball nestled in and proudly resting above the other assorted toys and trinkets. Ah, the masterful lies of the magic 8-ball, I reminisced. The brainchild of the Brunswick Billiard Company. The huge conglomerate that sells the lies of many childhood dreams that never come true as predicted. Girls who were supposed to fall in love with boys that didn't. Fortunes promised to be made, and dreams of fame which never bloom into reality. All those lies that lay heavy on a child's heart, creating a myriad of future mental issues, all for the profit of some CEO exec. Whatever brings the cash, enabling him to purchase another yacht or beachside home, no matter the cost of shattered youthful dreams being crushed. That's when the recollection of one specific question wafted into my mind and gently settled into the foggy topic of the moment with a thunderous thud. I sat back, my body propped against the wall below the window, gently resting my head against the painted horsehair plaster and gently closing my eyes to replay the last question I had asked. The one the 8-ball answered just before I tucked it neatly away with all the other worn out and broken souvenirs from my childhood to be retired into storage and forgotten. Magic 8-ball. Will I ever be famous? I gently shook the 8-ball several times as instructed before revealing its answer. I now remembered the day precisely as it happened. It was way back when I was 12 years old. I had kept the black round birthday gift with the white encircled number 8 boldly displayed like a badge of honor out on the shelf for almost 4 years to the day I had unwrapped it way back. I was down in the dumps on that particular day because I was told I had to clean up my room immediately. William Gregory Mansfield, I've asked you for the final time. Your grandparents are coming to celebrate your birthday tomorrow, and I want that cluttered room of yours straight as an arrow before they get here, young man. If it's not, we'll just skip your birthday celebration this year. No presents or cake. I knew she meant business with the threat of skipping my birthday. Mom loved family celebrations even more than us kids, but today I needed a celebration. The girl I thought I was in love with dumped me Friday afternoon just before the last school bell rang. I knew what the blues were all about now, and to top things off, I now had to work in my room cleaning like a chained prisoner from the work camp, clearing all the weeds along the highway. I looked up and saw the magic 8-ball just sitting on the shelf. I picked it up, first thinking I'd open my window and just chuck it out to the street, watching the dang thing explode and shatter into pieces. It had lied to me so many times in my past. It held no value anymore, only harsh reminders of things that never came to be. I unlashed the window locks and pushed up with all my strength, breaking the seal of paint that held the window tightly closed. After expending most of my strength and frustration getting the window open, I looked out and saw my friends playing tag in the quiet intersection, our usual spot to meet. I lost the feeling of anger in a flash and instead looked down at the dusty black round ball with the white circle and black numeral 8 on it. I decided to ask it one last question before stowing it away in the cardboard box already full of junk from past birthdays and Christmases. After asking those 5 simple words once more, Will I ever become famous? I continued to shake it before slowly turning the bottom upward where the answer would be revealed to me in its purplish blue triangle. It is decidedly so. I briefly stared at the answer before letting out a sarcastic guffaw. Yeah, right, my ass. I looked down one last time before stowing the stupid toy away, which now brings me to the day I rediscovered it on my way to packing up my room for college. I once again picked up the ball of untruths and repeated the same question, knowing it would likely reveal a different answer this time since it was merely a toy of chance. After asking the same question years earlier, I repeated it word for word. Will I ever become famous? I turned it over, readying myself for yet another resounding guffaw from disgust. It is decidedly so. I laughed out loud before finishing what I had started to do years ago and should have done all along. I opened the window, which opened much easier in my older and more physically fit shape. Seeing no one out front, I grabbed the softball-sized black plastic toy and chucked it out as high as I could towards the intersection of the asphalt streets. With a much quieter bang when it hit solid ground than I expected, it splintered off into several pieces before what was left rolled awkwardly to the curb catty-cornered from our house. It wobbled several sickly lopes before entering the storm sewer opening and disappearing into the darkness forever gone from my sight. That would be the end of the story of my birthday gift's life and recollections, if not for where I found myself many years later. 3. The Trip, 2024. I've always been the guy who finds himself driving by old stomping grounds or my home I grew up in an attempt to relive moments from my past. I like the feeling of remembering. It's like a drug calling out to me, demanding I answer the call. Melancholy is a feeling I embrace and am very comfortable with. Reflective times. Moments spent calculating my choices and where they have led me. I'm generally a happy person, but I do find myself sometimes dwelling amongst sadness. I've never felt I am out of control, though. I can turn these feelings of sorrow on and off like a light switch, which is why I wasn't alarmed at first when a slightly newer but stranger version of this swept over me. That was before the magnitude of it overtook my ability to maintain control and completely swallowing me into its captivity, much like a caged bird. The walls began closing in on me. I was with my wife, son, and her parents as we sat in a restaurant set in nostalgic 70s style. Pop art on the walls like Andy Warhol, album covers framed from bands like Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Joe Cocker. I'd been fine, I thought at first. It was just the heat affecting me. We laughed at some of the displays, such as the vintage yo-yo sign and lava lamps oozing their goo from the top then dropping down to the bottom of the colored water. I was happy and talkative just moments before everything changed. Suddenly, I felt like I was sitting before a giant living postcard. There was movement within the picture, but it felt like a Picasso painting of somewhere I had been before but couldn't quite remember when or where I was. Deja vu with an eerie twist. As I sat, attempting to fake a feeling of normality so no one would worry, when in truth I was sailing far overhead peering down at the scene from above. I felt a feeling of fear I'd never known before. I'm the guy that doesn't panic, yet I felt a horribly unfamiliar feeling setting in. I'm the guy who rarely feared anything, but I was frozen with a strong, uncomfortable apprehension in an instant. I feared I was losing control of myself as everything from what I saw, smelled, and tasted seemed new and unknown, foreign and very unworldly from the place I was from. I was in another world running parallel with the universe everyone else was in, lost in the cosmos, yet in enough control to nod my head to the conversation that was being discussed as if I remained focused in it, which I was not. Their language became foreign, syllables rolling off their tongues in tones I had never before heard. My first thought was that someone had slipped something in my drink or laced my food with LSD. I certainly was poisoned either with purpose or possibly accidentally. Should I say something? Shall I let my family know I may possibly be in trouble? I didn't want to cause panic or make a scene. I tried to ascertain if I were the only one in the restaurant experiencing the oddities I was. Would I recognize the signs if they were? I was clueless. "William, are you okay?" My wife's voice sounded distant and echoey, as if we were deep in a cavern and she had called out to me from across a distance, her words losing their volume as they bounced from wall to wall before reaching me. I strained to decipher what I was barely hearing in one moment, yet almost screaming in my ear the next. "William, your forehead is dripping with sweat. Are you hot? Your face is flush. Take a drink of cold ice water, honey." I wanted to answer her, but I couldn't make any words exit my mouth, feeling as if cotton balls were encrusted on the inside of my cheeks. My tongue, thick and gooey, caused me to fear any attempts at talking would come out garbled and sounding like a toddler's gibberish. Her voice echoed again, only much louder before fading off into a whisper. "William, do you hear me?" I saw people looking our way to the table we sat. I was sitting in my seat, but also seeing the scene from above, and then several other different angles and perspectives of the room. Am I having a heart attack or stroke? Is a seizure going to drop me to the floor? My eyes scanned the room, and though the scenery moved quickly like snapshots in one of those old-time machines that looked like a stop-action film when you cranked the handle and peered into the binocular eyepieces, I was able to focus on every detail, yet nothing but a blur all at once. Voices kept mixing. My wife's, my in-laws, and my son's, along with a myriad of unfamiliar ones. It was like an orchestra playing sheet music filled with human verbiage in harmony, yet I could make out individual words like solos. It was maddening, and internally I begged it to cease. My eyes caught a black blur, and I somehow focused upon it. It was a goddamned magic 8-ball. The sight of it brought a second of calm before I noticed the glue and cracks showing it had been repaired. It couldn't possibly be. I was now 64 years old, close to 5 decades since I had hurled that damned black 8-ball from the second story of our house. It had flown from my own hand and onto the paved road. I had seen it explode into several pieces with my own eyes. What was happening? Had I angered my maker and now being punished? My wife, our son, and I were visiting her folks where they now lived. A fairly quiet and artsy community that was 3 states away from the house I grew up in and had thrown the toy from its window. Impossible. There was no way the 8-ball I was looking at was the one and the same. The calm from the sight of it now speedily went from confusion to full-blown panic. I started blabbing words, trying to explain the thoughts going through my head. I knew by the look in their eyes I was speaking sentences they were unable to understand. The possibilities of what this whole scenario could mean kept bouncing in and out of my mind like a tennis ball in a heated match. My wife's parents looked at me as if I were a crazed person, suffering a psychotic episode, and the look in their eyes caused me to close within tightly and enter self-preservation mode. I went silent and waited for the explosion. I knew it was coming. What in the world was happening to me? Had aliens snatched me up and done experiments on my brain and then reinserted me back into my world to see what would happen? I've never doubted myself and the world I lived in until this very moment. I didn't know who or what to trust. Was my brain suffering a chemical reaction causing me to doubt my existence? The walls kept closing in tighter. Is this what a mental breakdown consists of? Who could help me or explain this to a point it made sense and give me calm to the lack of control I was feeling? I pictured the movie The Matrix and imagined I had been hooked up to the machine feeding the alien and giving it life up to the point I had broken free and realized what was happening. Now it had turned on me and was attempting to snuff my existence from its web. Either that, or I was clinically insane and suffering a massive meltdown. I just couldn't concentrate enough to define which was more plausible. "Calm down, William. We are all here to help you." My wife's lips spoke with a quiet, reassuring tone I couldn't make myself believe. Just words to trick me into letting my guard down so I could be taken out. My son chimed in behind her. "Dad, it's okay. We got you. You're going to be all right." Again, the voice I heard seemed as if it were scripted and forced. The effect was not sufficient to slow my rapid breathing or lull me into any form of calm. I attempted to inhale slow, long, and deep breaths, filling my lungs to their capacity so I would build the strength to cut and run. but it didn't help. I was much too weak now. I looked at the familiar faces around the table, people I should trust, but now couldn't. My focus widened to others at tables around the room who continued staring in shock. They all wore the likeness of out-of-focus circus clowns, their faces molded into rubbery, distorted Halloween masks, letting eking, hissing noises escape from their rubber lips that were oversized and flopping about. Escape. That is the only thought that continually raged through my mind. I felt as if I were a trapped rodent in the corner of a room filled with hungry killer cats ready to pounce upon me at any moment to shred and feed on my torn and clawed flesh. I feared becoming their fodder, overloaded on catnip, forcing them to react in crazy, unexpected movements. I ascertained the only feasible thing to do was to force myself up and run as fast as I possibly could over anything or anyone who got in my way. I was terrified. Hovering above every thought that came and went was the same line in my head. It is decidedly so. It is decidedly so. Is this what would make me famous? Flipping out in a public place and possibly being gunned down in the parking lot as I escaped the scene by some trigger-happy, overzealous rookie on the force deeming me a threat to society? A moment later, I couldn't feel a thing. My body stiffened and the lights went out. As quick as someone throwing the main breaker on a fuse box, I was out cold, memory deleted. When I woke up, I had no idea where I was. I assumed a mental institution. I'd written about one, down south during my investigative reporting days. The atrocities which had been taking place for years was abhorrent. Would I now be an unfortunate soul getting experimented on and given drugs to turn me into a zombie? A crazed tool of war for the army? Maybe I was already drugged and the feelings of panic I was experiencing were part of some research project I'd been enrolled in against my will. This feeling, this trying to recollect a memory that didn't feel like mine now felt fake or implanted. Was I even real anymore? Was I ever? While I no longer seemed to be suffering panic, I was overwhelmed by a deep feeling of being lost or deserted. Left behind like a sole survivor floating in the middle of an ocean, all alone and clueless of how long I'd been adrift or where I was. If not for the constant lapping of the calming waves against the raft which held me, I knew the anxiety would begin attacking once more. A faint memory of being a once happy-go-lucky and mediocre journalist, I now was uncertain if anything inside my brain was real or maybe I had become nothing but a collection of tissue, cells, and brain matter with absolutely no purpose here other than be trapped within a question mark. Like Pinocchio, I want to be real again. I want to be a real boy, not a wooden puppet forced to do the bidding of some unseen controller hidden behind a cloak of darkness. "Mr. Mansfield?" The man in the white medical coat spoke. "Mr. Mansfield, over here, sir." He snapped his finger, drawing my blank attention. "We've been doing some blood tests, and—" "Who are you?" I asked. Where am I? My family." "Mr. Mansfield, you are at the Central City University Hospital. I'm Dr. Albert Kander, and your family, your wife, son, and folks, are in the waiting room anxiously awaiting to hear how you are doing. You arrived here by ambulance after experiencing a breakdown of sorts. We are running some tests to see what possibly brought this event on." He continued talking, but his words became a string of foreign gibberish to me, much just like before the lights went out. I lost my attention span for him the minute I heard him say the entire episode played out in under 5 minutes, and my family was waiting to see me when he gave them the all clear. I knew the episode lasted far more than 5 minutes. Worlds could be created in the time I spent down the rabbit's hole. Words I didn't even know I had heard before began to form questions in my mind, and I suddenly began speaking, asking. "A breakdown? High anxiety? Really?" I questioned, not believing something so simple falling from his mouth could explain away my gut-wrenching episode of what I saw as two worlds colliding into a cataclysmic catastrophe. "How do I know I haven't been poisoned? Will this happen to me again?" I asked in a demanding and defiant tone. "Have you been under any undue pressure lately? Work, at home, anything you can recall?" "Nothing like that. I can't think of a thing. I'm usually scared of nothing, but I've never felt so fright-filled and helpless, totally out of control of my surroundings. my thoughts, my actions. The doctor interrupted me and asked, "At any time, did you feel like causing any bodily harm to yourself or anyone else?" Are you kidding me? I know my face was beginning to redden. I could feel the heat and the pulsing and pumping of blood through the veins in my temples. Is the government forcing you to ask these questions? Absolutely not. I've never wanted to hurt anybody or myself. No, I haven't been having troubles at home or work. This came on like a runaway freight train from nowhere. One minute I'm sitting with my family enjoying a meal. The next second my brain is filled with fear and confusion as I watch everyone around me become melting cartoon people. My breathing began to become labored. I just want to be back to normal. I desperately sucked for air, unable to feel like my lungs were filling to capacity. I never saw the nurse coming around to the side of my bed. I never felt the needle stick as she apparently shoved the medication into my vein. All I felt was a flooding and euphoric calm rush over me as the faces smiled, their hands waving goodbye to me as if I were aboard a giant cruise ship waving bon voyage to those left behind on the dock. Lulled into a fantasy world that felt safe and warm, fuzzy and cute, but not real, not the world I belonged in. Suddenly, I sank into blackness filled with empty silence, all alone, frozen in time. 4. Life continues. Being a writer from an early age, I always enjoy any library, especially one new to me. I was thrilled at the thought of being able to visit the Library of Congress for the first time in my life. While the magic 8-ball of my youth had fed me lies of me one day being famous, I had been afforded a wonderful life fulfilling my dream of being a journalist. The newspaper I worked for my entire career up until and including today was very rewarding. I had received several accolades along the way and assumed this was the level of fame the black plastic ball of foretelling knowledge was, well, foretelling. I held no great disappointments in the way my life was turning out. Retirement was around the corner as I was coming up on the age of 65. My wife and I were looking forward to seeing the country from one end to the other, bottom to top, while traveling it in the comfort of an RV. I was looking forward to possibly working on my memoirs to seal up the good life I had led and possibly share what I had learned along the way. Literary fiction called out to me, and I felt I had a few stories and books inside my head before my ultimate departure from Earth. There was, of course, like anyone else's life and marriage, a few ups and downs and unseen obstacles to be traversed, but PATRON and I had found love in each other along with our fair share of happiness and unusually good health. This would be my first trip up on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. I was given the gift of visiting the Library of Congress as a retirement perk from the company I'd worked for my entire career. The library's campus was made up of 3 separate buildings, and upon entering it, it instantly felt as if it would be the pinnacle of my career. I was excited to say the least as I walked through the large entryway. That excitement quickly transformed into pure awe as I began to visually take in all the majesty of its size. Hundreds, if not thousands of shelves and books displayed. The room echoed with silence, but one knew all the volumes perched staunchly upright side by side held words from all the varying imaginations of authors and time. Within that silence, there certainly must be the hum and rumble of all the words contained within all the inked pages, scrambling about to be heard and read. My heart began to pulse heavier as if prodded to do so by all the authors represented. In this first moment of being overwhelmed while imagining the collection of hours it had taken to fill all the pages in all the books portrayed, I knew full well how long it had taken me, myself, to write the manuscripts I had written. A great portion of my life was sitting at a table tapping away in silence alone while my family graciously and patiently put up with my absence. I was suddenly reminded by the 4 simple words which had somehow haunted me my entire life from the day I unwrapped that damn birthday present on the celebration of my 8th year of life. It is decidedly so. How in the world this ridiculous string of words has stuck with me in my memory bank for almost 57 years puts me beside myself. I swear when I even think of them, I see them in that purplish blue triangle inside my head, taunting me with the lies the Brunswick Billiard Company filled me with. telling me I would be famous as if I were ludicrous to even doubt it. I had spent my childhood believing I would become famous, and all because of a black plastic 8-ball designed to make a company millions of dollars by placing false hopes and dashed dreams into 20 separate random lies. My heart began to throb, and the memory of a family dinner gone bad years and years ago did nothing to ease the oncoming sensation building within. There must be a devil trapped inside me, born to perpetuate these unwarranted attacks of panic contained inside my body and soul. I looked up at the shelves towering above and below me. I was surrounded by words. Their leather-bound spines began to glimmer in and out of focus as they trembled on the shelves as if attempting a massive breakout. If I were to die at this moment, the thought of being trampled by or drowning in the hundreds of years of written words from famous writers, spilling their thoughts and dreams over my bones or into my lungs after being freed from their captive stark white pages, well, there could be far worse ways to die inside my thoughts. "Excuse me, sir?" 3 words from a stranger somehow broke through the chasm of thoughts circling inside the structure of my mind, and I turned to answer. "Yes?" "I'm sorry to bother you, sir, but..." The younger gentleman, possibly college-aged, nervously attempted to gather his thoughts before continuing. "I'm certain you've probably heard this 100 times before, but you look dead spot on, like W.G. Mansfield, if he were to be your age, of course." All the internal scrambling within my brain came to an abrupt halt instantly, like the dead calm after the lightning bolt strikes the tree and splinters it before your eyes. I smiled. "Why, young man, I am W.G. Mansfield. William Gregory Mansfield, in fact." "The W.G. Mansfield?" he asked, almost as if he were in disbelief. "The only one I know." I smiled and laughed whimsically. But he's famous." "Well, I'm not aware of any fame of mine." "And he's been dead for 20 or so years." I was stunned. I felt a pain so deep within my heart I wasn't sure if its beating would continue. I was speechless, not knowing how to respond. Had a wasp dropped into my shirt and stung my chest? "His books are up on the 4th floor, sir. Would you like me to show them to you?" I must have changed color to a ghostly white because the young man held out his hand to aid my now trembling body. I felt as if I had aged 20 years in an instant. I wasn't sure if it were the news of being famous or being told I had died 20 years earlier, but I did take his hand and begin to follow. "Is this some kind of intricate joke you play on visitors here?" I asked. "No, sir, not at all. I've been most fascinated by the writings of Mansfield," he responded, as if were ignoring the fact I had told him who I was. He led me to an elevator, and as the door closed and the journey upward began, he started to speak again. "I've read them all, at least twice." I saw a twinkle in his eyes, if he were gloating with pride of his achievement. "I, of course, have my favorite." "Tell me, what name do you go by?" I questioned. Tim Gallo. I'm a junior at Georgetown University. English major with a journalism minor." "Well, Tim Gallo, that is a very challenging choice you've made. It sounds almost as familiar as déjà vu to me," I answered, while attempting to decipher the entire matter of circumstance I was now encased in, wondering exactly what books this young man was taking me to see. "It's just uncanny, sir, how much you look like him. Like I was saying, I do have a favorite, the slaying of demons." I finished his sentence. "Yes, sir, brilliant work. I've read it 4 times and was thinking about starting it again. I just hate it was his last book." "How in the world did you find it? I was never able to find a publisher that would look at it with any seriousness." The young Tim Gallo looked over at me with a coy smile before continuing. His wife, Katrin, had his first book he had ever written, Where the 8-Ball Lies, published about a year after his death. 2005 Penguin Random House, went bestseller within 2 weeks. "I'll be a son of a..." The bell chimed and a digital voice announced, "4th floor," as the door slid open. My mind was returning to the mad spin, the swirling madhouse it was before Tim Gallo stepped in and added the finishing blow. I couldn't understand what was happening. It made no sense at all. I know I didn't hear him wrong or misunderstand his date. He said 2005, a year after I presumably died. But I was here. I was alive. That would have put my death 20 years earlier. What was happening? The real quandary to this entire thing was, I hadn't written my first book until 2018. How could it have been published 13 years before I ever even began writing it? I looked around while carefully observing anyone who was near us, looking for perked ears or people far too concerned with our conversation. There must be cameras hidden somewhere. This had to be some intricate joke conceived by one of my co-workers as a retirement gag or something. Either that, or Dr. Kander had missed the ticket by a long shot. Maybe I was clinically insane, but somehow still a functioning madman, like an alcoholic who was able to cope with daily life. Whatever it was, I needed to slip out and call Katrin before this escalated into something out of my control. Tim gave my arm a gentle tug, steering me to the left and down between a row of 7 or 8 tier shelving. Book after book, title after title began dizzying me. "It's up here, not much farther, Mr. Mansfield." He obviously didn't believe I was who I claimed to be, even though he had been the one who stated I looked like an exact replica of the famous author. He suddenly stopped and reached up to the 3rd shelf from the top and drug his pointing finger down a line of spines until it stopped. His fingertips slid to the top and hooked the book, pulling it in an angle toward him until he could grip it with his full hand. "Here it is. The Slaying of Demons. The creme de la creme of writing." Tim opened the book and began to read. "'Twas neither truth nor—" I joined him in the speaking out loud as I stood too far from the page to read. "Nor lie when the demon spoke. It was mere smartly crafted words from its forked tongue, and they stuck to me as if coated in paste and fire. My ears became heated as his callous sentiment tumbled through the stench-filled air and entered the canals of my ears. It was at this point my skin became singed. I knew this beast within brought me no goodwill and must be slayed." Tim looked up at me in awe. "I can go on, if you like?" I asked. "You really are him, aren't you?" He quickly flipped to the last pages of the hardbound book in his hand, the author's page. There at the top was a picture of W.G. Mansfield. Tim looked down at it, studied it momentarily, and then returned to my face and once more glanced at the picture as he pulled the book closer to his eyes. He reached over and gently brushed the longer graying hair across my forehead over to one side, revealing the same dark-tinted birthmark in the same spot on the forehead of the picture. "How can it be?" he asked. I looked at him and shrugged in shared question. "I have no idea. As far as I've known, this book and all my others are only files stored on my laptop. I'd thought about indie publishing them back when I wrote them, but knew my marketing skills would get them nowhere. I really wrote my own pleasure. Therapy. My self-medication to slay the demons that lay dormant most of the time. I always felt as if I could rid myself of them by exposing them on paper for others to see someday. I had been foretold I would be famous one day, but I never believed. Mr. Mansfield, these..." "Please, Tim, call me William. I think we've come far enough now, even though it's been a very short time, to be on a first-name basis." "Okay, William. These books of yours they're brilliant. They are moving, telling, even teaching. You deserve the fame. You've earned the shelf your works now sit here in the Library of Congress. I've gotten more out of your writing than I have in 3 years of my classes. I can't believe I'm talking to you, let alone being able to call you William." My eyes surely showed the confusion I felt. "Tim, I appreciate your kindness, but I don't even know if I'm truly alive or not. It all makes no sense. I don't even know if my wife is still where I left her at home. I saw her 2 days ago, but is that 100 years in present time? Where has time gone? Am I stuck in a world that seems woven between reality and fiction? If I'm supposedly dead, what did I die from? And where's my body buried? Mr. Mansfield? William? Tim slowly flipped the author's page over, revealing more on the back. He held the book out toward me to read. If you really want to know, it's on this page. My hand shook as I grasped the bound volume in my hand. I hesitated, not knowing if I were mentally ready to read the circumstance of my demise. If I were truly dead, how could I lift and hold this leather-bound, 80,000-word literary fiction within my grasp now? Ghosts can't defy the force of gravity pulling downward, not being a ghost merely visible as a mist gathered in the air, an image with no substance. I took the copy and held it in my hands, lightly dragging my fingertip over its shiny leather finish. I could feel the bumps and cracks stamped into the leather. If I were truly a ghost, I would imagine any sensations such as this impossible. As I studied the cover, I noticed it contained no image like the cover I had created for it. It bore merely the title at the top in what appeared to be gold leaf lettering and W.G. Mansfield across the bottom in the same. I stared at it, almost forgetting that Tim was standing nearby watching. My gaze moved around the room, realizing all the history nestled within. The hundreds, if not thousands, of writers' works stored together for others to pull from the shelves and savor. The Magic 8-Ball had somehow been more than just a silly toy created by a huge conglomerate to pad their bank accounts and financial portfolio. It hadn't been the demon I had made it out to be, one designed to merely haunt my existence with falsehoods throughout my life. It was so much more. It was a world of its own held inside the black plastic encasement for reasons I would never truly understand. Had it been given to me to let me know my life would not be a waste or go unnoticed and without recognition? Had it been the tool designed to aid in the legacy I would leave behind? Standing right here next to me was a living example of a life I had never previously known, but was touched by words I put together in a string that talked to him, spoke to him in ways that he understood and instilled value to him. I became lightheaded, attempting to absorb it all in. The demon of doubt within me was also swaying inside my head. I could feel him beginning to falter. Tim must have noticed and slowly walked me over to a table in the middle of the large reading room. There were others sitting at tables a distance from us, heads buried in books held in their hands or laid flat upon the tables. They appeared to be feeding their brains, letting the matter within soak up the writings of someone fortunate enough to have been given a home for their works to live and remain alive through the tests of time, giving knowledge and thought-provoking ideas to ponder. I wasn't sure how I could ever pull myself away from this odd trap my brain appeared to be caged within. It wasn't scary like before. There was a pleasance this time. It felt like I was at home in a warm leather reading chair with the light shining down in the perfect mix of tone and spectrum. Cozy, comforting, and anxiety-free. I wanted to know what the next page read, what it held in words, the language I loved most, explaining what had happened. But I was so at ease, I wasn't certain I wanted to risk losing this fragile moment I was encased in. I did long to hear my wife's voice, though I had heard it just this morning over the phone when she called to wish me well on my visit to the library. It seemed warmer than usual now that I think upon it, but I took no real notice of any difference at the time. Now that conversation seems so distant, as if years had passed since her words sounded melodical to my ears. Her voice always gave me comfort. Even when spoken in anger, I knew she would always love me. I needed to hear her voice again. I had to know she was alive and still remembered me and the love we shared between us. I stepped out and away from the people concentrating on their books and would call to say hello, tell her how much I love her, and then say goodbye as if it were the last time. Then I'd come back and read how I was taken from this world and moved to the next level. 5. Goodbyes are never easy. The phone rang twice before I heard the magic of her hello. I was quick to say I love you to her. William? She quickly spoke before a tone of doubt crept into her voice. Who is this? It's me, sweetheart, your loving husband. The line went deathly quiet. I I don't know who this is, but it's not funny. How did you get this number? She questioned. William is not here. He will never be here again. Sweetheart, it's me, William. I just wanted to hear your voice. I needed to hear you and let you know I love you. William? It can't be. It's not really you. You're gone. You've been gone for so long. Sniffles took the place of her confused and saddened words. I instantly felt my heart breaking. I knew now what I had dreaded reading. It was true. I was no longer a part in this world, in her world. I felt the crack that I knew lay dormant for some time grow wider. I'd been so careful to nurse it so it wouldn't spread any further. I felt that crack widening as my heart continued to break as I listened to the tears and sighs on the other end of the line we were connected by. I knew my time with her was very short. A sixth sense, I suppose. It is me, Katrin. I know I can't explain. I just wanted you to know that I do love you, and I'm okay now. I'm at peace. I finally slayed the demon, honey. It's dead and gone. The phone line went dead after she whispered, I love you too, William. I slowly walked back into the room and sat down where my book, The Slaying of Demons, lay open to the page I feared would send me away to some other place I wasn't prepared to go. At least at this moment, I knew I could call and hear my wife's name. I could nestle into a warm leather chair and read any author my heart desired. This library could be my heaven. I wasn't sure if I'd be sent to another pleasant spot, or possibly hell, or some horrible derivative of such. If only I now held that magic 8-ball, I could ask it and know before I took the risk of reading the last paragraph. Tim looked at me as if he knew I had a great challenge facing me. I wasn't sure if he was just that perceptive or if he was somehow a bigger part of this than I knew. Maybe, just maybe he was a guardian angel sent to usher me into the next world. If I were supposed to be informed ahead of time, the 8-ball would be sitting on the table beside my book, and it wasn't. It must be a sign of choosing my fate by faith. I took a deep breath and looked over at Tim before lowering my eyes to the page I somehow knew would lead me somewhere other than here. I began to read. W.G. Mansfield never saw the accomplishments and accolades of his writing. He authored 12 books in a matter of 3 years along with countless short stories. He never became published while he lived, having been rejected by all the major publishing houses with his first manuscript. William never attempted to query another, believing his work not worthy. William Gregory Mansfield was driving home from a seminar one stormy night when a bolt of lightning struck the vehicle he was driving as it crossed the Missouri River. Witnesses traveling behind him and heading toward him in the opposite lane stated the entire bridge's steelwork lit up in a brilliant glowing flash as his car traveled through the railing and over the side high above the deep, swift water. Every one of those witnesses, 6 separate accounts traveling in 4 separate vehicles, claimed the victim's car did not fall toward the water, but instead rose into the sky and disappeared in a great ball of light. William's vehicle nor body was ever recovered, and his death remains a mystery. All his works have since been published by Penguin Random House and inducted into the Library of Congress in 2010. Upon finishing the last word of the printed paragraphs within The Slaying of Demons by W.G. Mansfield, a bright light flashed throughout the library as the power flickered in every building on Capitol Hill for several seconds. When the power was restored, all was as it was, except for the copy of William's book found lying open to the last paragraphs of the author's page. There was a single fingerprint freshly seared into the bottom of that page. There was no sign of either Tim Gallo or William Gregory Mansfield ever again. The Magic 8-Ball is still produced using the same model as its original inception and sold today under the company name Mattel. Does it still turn a profit? It is decidedly so.
The world we live in is full of things we don't understand. Being the curious humans that we are, We naturally try and seek these things out. Doing so has led us to remarkable discoveries and inventions that we never could have imagined 100 years ago. We have defeated disease, built to the sky itself, and even created machines that could take us beyond the clouds and into the stars. If our ancestors could see us in what we've created, I'm sure many of them would see us as gods. Our innate curiosity and lust for knowledge has not always led us to greatness, however. True evil and darkness have also been uncovered in humanity's conquest of knowledge. And in the end, I fear this evil will be our doom. I do not say this from the standpoint of a great philosopher who has sat and simply pondered things either. No, I say this because I have seen it, experienced it. I was a part of it. The event I'm about to relay to you is true in its entirety. This I swear. I feel certain that this will fall on deaf ears, and many of you will believe this to be just another spooky story meant to give you cheap thrills. But I promise you that this is neither my intent nor my purpose. The purpose of this story is to simply warn you of what lurks beyond the veil of what we can see and understand, to show you what awaits us in the darkness, even if I myself don't understand it. What I'm about to tell you has happened, and I feel certain it will happen again. In 1971, a not-so-well-known scientist began preparation for an extremely secretive project known simply as the Harbinger experiment. I would like to keep the identity of the scientist a secret for personal reasons, so throughout this recounting, I will refer to him as Zimmerman. Zimmerman's background is unclear at best beyond 1971. All that is known about him before that time is that he had grown up somewhere in Maryland with a strange fascination of the occult and supernatural. This latter made him an outcast among his fellow scientists due to how scoffed upon the metaphysical was, and still is, at the time. Zimmerman's options concerning the otherworldly were not the sole cause for him being an outcast, though. It was his methods that made him widely unaccepted among his peers. Zimmerman was well known during this time for being ruthless and cold beyond measure. He never cared about the means. All that mattered to him was results. And if he predicted the results to be valuable enough, anything would be worth obtaining them. It was this insatiable and brutal lust for the truth that made him feared among those that knew of him, and the few that knew of him and did not fear him believed in him and followed him and his work closely. The word Harbinger itself has such a mysterious and intimidating taste to it. Maybe it's the way it rolls off our tongues, or maybe it's simply due to its association with the project. But the word always seems to carry a certain amount of doom with it, which would make sense. The word itself means to warn or forebode. I can't imagine Zimmerman's reasons for giving the experiment this title, but in retrospect, it fits perfectly. Zimmerman came to a select few, me being one of them. He told us he was working on something big, and that he needed people who could keep confidentiality and not spread idle gossip of his work. While he did not fully trust some of us, he did know that we were professionals and that for some reason or another, we were all in dire need of employment. I had worked at the local clinic as a doctor, but I was caught stealing medication and was promptly fired. This left a very dark mark on my resume, so work was hard to find. I also was a native to Alaska and lived near where the experiment would take place, so I guess you could say I was a convenient choice. As you can imagine, I jumped at the opportunity. It was hard not to when I saw the payout. 15 of us were hired in total. Some were colleagues of his that had been working with him for a while. Some were maintenance workers, and a few were hired as private security. I was the only medical professional to be hired. It is still a wonder to me how he even attained the funds necessary for the experiment. I would not be wholly surprised if his financing was not entirely legal. But, legal or not, I needed the money and he was paying. Looking back, it's a decision I have come to regret. After Zimmerman obtained his money, he used it to buy a relatively large plot of land deep in the frozen wilderness of Alaska. And upon that piece of land, Zimmerman built a concrete structure, not dissimilar to a bunker, in fact, the sole difference being that its goal was to keep any potential damage contained within the structure rather than keeping it out, as he put it. Most of the structure dug underneath the earth, which had the effect of making the underground complex seem so much smaller than it really was from the outside, as would be expected. There was only one way of entering and leaving the underground structure, and it was via a ladder that led from a small, unassuming concrete building on the surface, which I will refer to from now on as the entrance building for convenience, to the network below. After everyone had gone to bed that night, the hatch that contained the ladder would be sealed off with a very large and thick metal lid. Zimmerman was very strict about this. Located not too far away from the entrance building was a series of wooden cabins that would serve as the sleeping quarters for the staff Zimmerman had hired. Compared to the entrance building standing on the surface, the underground system was massive. At the center of the complex was the control room. This was where all the facility's electronics and such were linked to. This included security cameras, lights, and door controls. Consoles, monitors, and computers lined the walls of this large central chamber. This is also where the ladder in the entrance building connected to in the underground complex. Connected to the control room were 3 doors. One led to a smaller room that served as the infirmary. Another door led to a break room, and the last door led into the hallways. The hallways are where the complex began to feel extremely eerie. They were, for some reason, laid out in an extremely confusing scheme that led in circles and to complete dead ends. These hallways made up a vast majority of the complex, and it would be very easy to get lost in the maze if you were unfamiliar with the complex. But if you knew where you were going, you would find yourself standing before one of 3 8x8 rooms before long. Each room had a camera hooked up to one of the corners of the room, and all 3 of those cameras were connected to a corresponding monitor in the control room. Cameras were also scattered throughout the hallways, so that whoever was watching their corresponding monitor could see anywhere they wanted to, when they wanted to. Thick metal doors stood at the entrance to each of the 3 8x8-foot rooms, and in order to open them, you would have to enter a 4-digit code into a panel located near the door. I remember when I first arrived at the complex how badly the hallways frightened me. I've always been claustrophobic, you see. Those hallways were so very narrow. The noise, or more accurately the lack of noise, was also a tremendous source of fear for me in those bleak, narrow hallways. It was always so unnaturally silent, as if the entire world had stopped moving. It really made you feel like you were trapped down there. Thankfully, though, I only rarely ventured into those hallways, for I was the only medical professional in the facility, and I had virtually no reason to go into them. In the beginning, I found it so peculiar that Zimmerman would ask for a medical professional like me on a project like this, but by the time it was all over, I understood why. The official purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to test and observe the effects of extended isolation on the human mind. This is what was listed on reports, being sent out at least. But unbeknownst to all those who were not participating in the project, excluding the subject, the true purpose was much darker. Like I said before, Zimmerman had always had an obsession with the occult and supernatural. He sought to prove himself to those who did not believe in him. He wanted physical proof that the supernatural was a real phenomenon, and he wanted to be the first one to attain said proof. The true purpose of the Harbinger experiment was to find proof of the metaphysical, a world we could not see. The thought of doing this was naturally a tad bit daunting and even scary, but it was Zimmerman's method of doing so that was truly terrifying. Zimmerman believed that he would be able to open a portal between worlds momentarily, allowing 3 random entities to cross over to our world, and each one of these beings would be trapped within one of 3 rooms. Zimmerman had the theory that any entity would try and latch on to the nearest living thing that had the capacity for it. He wanted to use this technique to trap a spirit in a physical form by allowing it to enter a living being that had been injected with a compound mixture of Zimmerman's creation. In theory, this compound would keep the entity from simply leaving whatever it was attached to. The only way it would be able to leave a host who had been injected with the compound was through death. According to Zimmerman, the host would have to be something living, with a will strong enough to survive the possession. And there is only one known species that possess the amount of will required for this: humans. Zimmerman had also done something to ensure that the entities would only enter the 3 rooms, and that there would only be 1 entity in each room, though I cannot say I know exactly what he did. In fact, I know next to nothing when it comes to how Zimmerman managed to do what he did. He liked to keep his methodology a secret to his most trusted colleagues, most likely due to his paranoia that someone would steal his ideas and take credit for the success of said ideas. If I had known that this was the true purpose before I signed up, I may have reconsidered. But Zimmerman decided not to tell us until we were all gathered at his fortress. Even if any of us wanted to leave, I doubt we would have been able to do so. The security team Zimmerman had hired was loyal to him and the payout. It is not likely that Zimmerman had given them the order to allow anyone to leave. There were 3 different subjects included in the experiment. All were native to Alaska, and each one was lured into the project under the belief that they would be participating in a harmless study of the effect of isolation on the human mind, as I mentioned before. Which is why none of the subjects objected when they realized that they would be confined to one of the 3 rooms that I mentioned earlier. The first subject was a young man. He was apparently out of work and desperately needed the money that had been offered for participating in the study. The second was a woman. By looking at her, I could tell she was an addict of some sort. The third and final subject was an older man, a drifter, if I had to guess. One thing that they all had in common was that none of them had any family or friends left. In short, no one would miss them, which is why they were chosen for this project. I'm so sorry. I wish I could supply more information about the subjects, but all of this has been drawn from memory, and I was given little information on the 3 to begin with. The experiment did not officially begin until 1987, 16 years after its original announcement. I was eager to begin, so I packed up and headed out to the complex as soon as I could. I arrived at the compound a week before the subjects had even signed up, and a whole month before the project even began. I was not the first to arrive by any means. When I got there, Zimmerman, his colleagues, and the security team had already arrived. I suppose you could say I was among the people Zimmerman did not trust to arrive first. Everyone had arrived about a week before the experiment began. There was a noticeable rift between those who were there simply for the money, like me, and those who were followers of Zimmerman. On October 15th, 1987, all the preparations were in place. The subjects had been sealed in their rooms. The cameras, lights, and speakers were fully operational, and all the staff members had settled in. The time had come for the experiment to officially begin. Zimmerman asked everyone to report to the control room around 9 p.m. to witness the beginning of the experiment. He wanted everyone to be present when he proved that all his theories had been correct and that he was not just a madman. He wanted us all to see the fruits of his labor. When everyone had finally gathered in the large control room, Zimmerman turned to us and simply said, "Observe." He then turned his back to us, leaned into the microphone that would project his voice through the 3 rooms, and then he began chanting in a strange language that I feel certain no one but Zimmerman could understand. We all observed the 3 large monitors on the wall, silently waiting for something to happen. The subjects all stood in their room, dumbstruck by Zimmerman's chanting, staring at the monitors with confused expressions on their faces. After about 5 minutes, I felt something awful. I cannot explain what exactly it was, but a horrible feeling of dread washed over me, riddling me with fear. It was then that the ground actually began to shake suddenly, and the lights began to flicker. Zimmerman continued chanting into the microphone as if nothing was off or wrong, while the subjects began dashing around their rooms, screaming for help. Then suddenly the ground stopped shaking, and the monitor's images turned into static. The air began to become very heavy as we all stared at the monitors, waiting for them to regain their image and show us what was happening or what had happened in those 3 rooms. For a while all was silent, but then there was screaming. The screams of a woman going through unbearable pain, and terror began to echo through the compound. The similar screams of men began to coincide with the woman's terrified screams, and together they mixed into an awful symphony of pain and fear that beat mercilessly into our ears. Those of us who were here for the money began to give each other scared looks, while those loyal to Zimmerman seemed completely unfazed. We wanted to leave and never come back to this awful place, but we all knew deep down that Zimmerman would never allow that to happen. We were here for the long haul. There was no escape. It was 10:13 p.m. when the screaming finally stopped. The monitors had yet to reveal to us what had occurred in those 3 rooms. As soon as the screaming ended, Zimmerman stood and dismissed us all for the night, adding that we were all forbidden to come back into the compound until 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. Not like any of us wanted to. We all solemnly made our way out of the compound and toward the cabins and settled in for the night. I feel it is safe to say that not all of us slept well that night, and I was not one of them. The following morning, all of the staff had arrived at the entrance building. We all stood inside exchanging tired or nervous looks as we waited for Zimmerman to arrive and open the hatch that concealed the ladder. I could see palpable fear in the eyes of some of us, while others did not seem to have been even remotely affected by what happened last night. Zimmerman showed up 5 minutes after 10, apologizing for his tardiness as he came through the door of the entrance building. He opened the hatch and, without any hesitation, began descending the ladder downwards into the black abyss. He almost seemed enthusiastic. I was the first to follow behind Zimmerman's dark descent into the facility. It seemed that the farther I climbed down, the more the darkness closed in on me, as if it was trying to swallow me whole. As I climbed deeper, I couldn't help but feel that this place was different somehow. While before there was only the unsettling concrete hallways and rooms, now there was something else. Something made the eeriness feel so real and personified. I felt like a horrible and gruesome scene awaited us down there, but I continued climbing downward, despite my fear and my hesitation. This was no longer just a spooky bunker. There was darkness and malevolence in the air. A true evil now lived here, and I could feel it. We all could. I finally felt my foot touch ground and let out a silent sigh of relief to be on solid ground. Almost as if on cue, the light bulbs came alive, dousing the room in their warm and welcome light. Zimmerman must have turned on the power, I thought. I allowed myself to take a couple of seconds to examine the control room. It was exactly as we had left it last night, for which I gave a silent and thankful prayer. It was almost as if nothing unusual had ever happened. I shook myself from my thoughts as I remembered the static-filled monitors from the night before. I let my eyes slowly make their way toward the monitors on the wall, anticipating the grim and fearful scenes that would be on them. My attention was first grabbed by Monitor 1 and 3, which were still pure static. It would have been a small relief, but then the motionless image on Monitor 2 caught my eye. Room 2 was entirely still, and everything seemed entirely untouched. I couldn't help but gasp as I noticed the only thing that was different. The woman lay in the center of the small concrete room. An expression of fear and terror was frozen onto her gaunt face as she lay silent and lifeless on her back. Zimmerman's expression turned angry when he saw this. He ordered that the second monitor be turned off, and it was. We didn't ask why. It's not like any of us wanted to see the dreadful scene any longer. He also ordered that if the images in monitors 1 and 3 did not return within the next 2 hours, the security team would be sent to investigate the rooms. The security team nodded at hearing this. They made it seem as if they had no fear, but I could see it in their eyes. The subtly loud tick-tock of the clock was the only sound that echoed through the control room while I stared at the monitors. An hour and 50 minutes had gone by, and static was still all that occupied Monitor 1 and 3. All of the other staff members were working except me. This was due to the fact that the project had been completely injury-free thus far, so I essentially had nothing to do but wait for someone to hurt themselves. Zimmerman, a couple of his colleagues, and I were the only ones that occupied the room. They quietly chatted amongst each other on the other side of the room, while I spent my time reading and pondering the situation I currently found myself in. I had clearly made a mistake coming here. The corpse lying in room 2 was evidence enough of this. God only knew what awaited us in rooms 1 and 3. My thoughts were soon interrupted as Monitor 3's image returned. The clear image now displayed on the screen made everyone's eyes noticeably widen. What was displayed on the monitor was horrifying. A humanoid thing stood in the center of the room, staring directly at the camera, unmoving. It was wearing the jumpsuit that Subject 3 had been issued, but this clearly was not the same man that had entered the room. What caught my attention first was its eyes. They were solid black and twice the size of normal human eyes. They seemed so endless and so cold. Its head had also grown with the eyes in such a symmetrical and unsettling manner. The being also shed all of the hair it once had, and even from the monitor I could see how unnaturally smooth and clear its skin was. It had also seemingly grown in height and stature, which could be seen in the fact that the jumpsuit was obviously far too small for his wear. The limbs had grown especially long. Its arms hung almost as low as the creature's knees. What we were looking at was in no way the same man we had sent inside. Fear. Fear was all I felt as I continued to stare into the monitor at the thing in the room. And my fear seemed to be shared by those around me, which made me feel kind of good. It may sound awful, but it was a bit satisfying to see that Zimmerman and his colleagues could feel fear too. But at the same time, it was worrying because this showed that this was not a part of Zimmerman's plan. Something had gone wrong. We all stared into the monitor at the thing despite our fear. It was almost as if we were in a trance. My already present fear began to grow and spread rapidly through my body as I became lost in the creature's eyes, trapped in its terrifyingly hypnotic gaze. After what felt like forever, I managed to break eye contact with the creature and divert my attention from the monitor, and when I did so, I felt my fear levels drop considerably. After a short while, Zimmerman ordered his security team to make their way to Subject 1's door just as he said he would do. The security team left without question, armed only with batons and pistols. I focused my attention on watching the men progress through the hallways towards Subject 1's room via the cameras. Even through the not-so-high-quality cameras, it wasn't hard to tell that these men were afraid of what awaited them. Their heads were downcast as they walked. They did not possess the same confidence within them that they did when this project began. They looked like little scared boys being sent off to a terrible war. Eventually, they made it to the door. We had perfect vision of them and the door via the hallway camera. One of them said something through one of their walkie-talkies and made a motion toward the camera. In response, one of Zimmerman's colleagues buzzed the door open. The men already had their pistols out by the time the button was pushed. Slowly, the door began to open. We all watched eagerly as the men began to approach the door, guns aimed inside. Suddenly, and without warning, there was a loud shriek, and as something bounded out of the room at the men, the monitor turned into static. Immediately, we could hear screaming echoing down the hallways, followed shortly after by the distinct sound of gunshots. We could do nothing but wait. After a couple of minutes, the screaming and gunshots stopped. We all waited and prayed, hoping that whatever bounded at them from the room would not be the one to return to the control room. After a couple more minutes, 3 of the men came back, carrying with them the corpse of the 4th. He had massive cuts covering his chest, and his face was shredded. You couldn't even tell who he was anymore, or even that he was human. I was used to gore, being a doctor and all, so I felt somewhat unfazed by the mass of shredded flesh and bloodied meat they carried with them. But many of the others went pale and vomited. The security team all wore emotionless expressions and eyes filled with terror. One of the men finally looked up at us. He stared at us for a while with those wide eyes of his. "It's dead," he finally managed to mutter in a shaken and scared voice. A couple hours went by. The dead man's name was Frank. He was buried outside in the cold Alaskan ground. 2 of the men were unharmed, physically at least. The 3rd was alive, but only barely. His body was covered in bloody slashes, and one of his eyes had been gouged out. I managed to stabilize him, but only just. The other 2 men vaguely explained what happened. Apparently, Subject 1 leaped out at Frank after the door had opened, only it wasn't really Subject 1 anymore. According to them, it had a hideously contorted face and long, sharp claws. They claimed to have shot it over 12 times before it fell dead, and then they emptied another 12 bullets just to make sure it was really dead. Only once it was dead did they come back. After tending to the wounded man, I went to investigate the monitors. As afraid as I was of seeing what those monitors may have held, I needed to see. Subject 3 was the only one left now, and I needed to see it and make sure the creature was still in his room. It seemed to be more like a jail cell than an ordinary room at this point, though, which was probably a good thing. The cameras displaying Subject 1's room and the hallway outside it still displayed a static-filled screen. No one was sent to repair them or investigate. We just had to hope that Subject 1 was well and truly dead. Monitor 3's image was exactly the same as I had left it. Subject 3 was still staring directly into the camera at us. He was still in the exact same position, and if it were not for the small fan in the corner of the room, I would think I was looking at a still image. In a way, I felt relief at seeing this. Relief that he was still in his room and had not escaped while no one was looking. After everything quieted down, I noticed something especially unusual. There was a strange sound emanating from somewhere. At first, it was barely noticeable. The only reason I heard it was because of how extremely quiet it was in the infirmary. But as time went by, it slowly began to increase in volume. After about an hour, it was loud enough that everyone else could hear it too. And after a couple more hours, its volume had increased so much we could determine what the noise was. It was a song. One of the staff members identified it as Living in the Sunlight by Tiny Tim. Apparently his father loved the song and listened to it frequently. The song seemed to be on a loop and kept replaying itself. Although we were able to identify the noise, we remained unable to identify its source. We knew that it wasn't coming from the speakers because we had turned them off. It seemed to be emanating from the walls themselves. More time ticked by as we all began to become increasingly agitated by the song. I spent most of my time in the infirmary, attending to Frank or in the control room. Fear hung in the air, and the presence of unmistakable darkness and evil was no doubt its source. Subject 3 still had not moved. He had kept his unblinking gaze fixed on the camera the entire time. It always felt like he was staring directly at me, no matter where I was in the room. I think this effect was also felt by others, due to the fact that they seemed to move around the room a lot, and for seemingly no reason. After a few hours, the song was so loud that people almost had to shout in order to communicate. We'd been trying to find its source so that we could turn the song off, but it was to no avail. The source was completely unidentifiable. This added a level of extreme irritation to our already very present fear. It was around 8:30 that the ground itself began to shake once again, just as it had done the previous night. Panic began to spread among my fellow employees and me as the shaking grew in intensity. During this, I had the sudden instinctual feeling to look over at Subject 3's monitor. It was gone. Almost as if on cue, the power went out. Thankfully, the song did as well. Ever since the security team came back, panic had slowly been building up among the staff, and Zimmerman was powerless to stop it. When those lights went out, the calm projections that everyone had been trying to maintain left us, and the fear in all our hearts took over. The emergency backup lights kicked on shortly after the power went out, which I gave a silent, thankful prayer for. The lights were dim, but they still allowed me to see a lot. Total panic seized us as many of my fellow staff members began screaming and rushing to the ladder in an attempt to escape. But too many were trying to use it at once, and no one was able to get very far in the ladder without someone else pulling them to the floor and taking their place. Zimmerman was shouting for everyone to calm down, but his dominating and intimidating personality had no effect here, and his demands fell upon deaf ears. It was total chaos. It wasn't long until people actually started hurting each other in their desperate attempts to get up that ladder and out of this place. I could only stand against the wall and wait for my opportunity to escape up the ladder. All the screams were soon silenced as the familiar hum of that unsettling song began to rise in volume again, only this time much quicker. And this time it was clear that the noise was coming directly from the maze-like corridors. People stopped fighting and shouting as all our attention shifted to the door that led into the hallways. The song quickly got louder than it had ever been before, which forced many of us to cup our ears with our hands in an attempt to silence the noise. Then, suddenly, the song just completely stopped. Silence. That was all that filled the room as we stared at the thick metal door in anticipation for what was coming. It felt like ages had gone by, but in reality it was probably just seconds before the silence was broken. The door suddenly and violently burst open, and the music started again, louder than it had ever been before. The suddenness and the volume of this caused many of us to recoil by falling to the ground and grabbing our ears in an attempt to block out the noise. I glanced up for just a second, and in the doorway stood a tall, smooth-skinned figure with long limbs and eyes so dark and malevolent you could clearly see them in the dim lighting. After I got my bearings, I looked upwards at the creature once again, just in time to see the thing pick up and rip Zimmerman in half in one fluid movement, dousing the room and everyone in it with his blood, intestines, and organs. I was no stranger to gore, but the sight of that was too much for me to bear. I hunched over immediately after seeing this and vomited all over the cold cement floor. That ladder is my only hope of survival, I thought to myself, as I forced myself to a standing position. And as my eyes rose along with the rest of me, I could see the thing ripping and tearing through the people as they scattered in an attempt to escape it. It was distracted, and as awful as it sounds, this was my only chance to get up that ladder. I forced my legs to move toward the ladder, trying to block out the terrified screams of my fellow staff members and the unbearably loud music. I could hear gunshots coinciding with the screams and terrible sounds of flesh being ripped apart somewhere in the mess of noise. I reached my hands outwards and felt a wave of relief wash over me as my fingers came into contact with the hard metal rungs of the ladder. I gripped them and began to climb upwards as quickly as I could in my disoriented state, all the while praying that the monster would not see me and pull me off the ladder and back into the slaughter. It felt like at any moment I would feel one of its smooth hands wrap around my ankles and pull me to my death, but I eventually made it to the top. There was no question in my mind. I had to close the hatch and seal that thing down there, even if it meant certain death for my colleagues. I could not allow that thing to escape. I gripped the thick metal lid and began to push with all my might in an attempt to seal the underground complex off. Despite how dense and sturdy it was, the lid was surprisingly easy to move and did not take very much effort to push it over the hatch, even in my weakened state. In seconds, the hatch was completely covered by the dense metal lid. I collapsed on my side and began to vomit some more as exhaustion overtook me. And as I lay there, I realized something. Aside from my labored breaths, the only thing I could hear was the faint echo of that song from down below. I felt as though I would lose more of my sanity if I continued to lay there and listen to that song, so I once again forced myself up to my feet and began to make my way to the wooden lodge I had stayed in the previous night. It was where I had left my baggage and also where I had left the keys to my truck. Of the 15 staff members that took part in that forsaken experiment, I am the only one that survived. I've never returned to the awful place where all this happened, and I don't intend to. The project was very secretive, and Zimmerman was the only one who knew all the details of it. As far as I know, no one is aware of my involvement aside from me. In fact, I am probably the only one who knows what the Harbinger experiment truly was, let alone what actually happened. By now, you are probably wondering why I have told you about something none of you should be aware of. Maybe you're expecting me to give you a speech about not messing with things you don't understand, or something along those lines. I hope not, for I have no speech to give or lesson to impart. I began hearing a noise earlier today. Almost immediately I recognized the noise as a very haunting and familiar song. I didn't even try to trace it to its source. I knew it would be pointless. And as the day has progressed, the song has increased in volume. It's loud enough now that I can very clearly make out the lyrics. I'm completely unable to escape Tiny Tim's voice. It has followed me everywhere I've gone. Subject 3 is coming for me, and I know my time left in this world is extremely limited now. I guess you could say that I just wanted to tell the tale of the Harbinger experiment before it was lost forever. I hope that you will take some lesson from what I have recounted to you, but I think we both know you won't. Let's be honest. You don't believe a word of what I've just told you, and I don't blame you. I wouldn't believe me if I were you. To you, this is nothing more than something to get cheap thrills from. Probably mindlessly surfing the internet when you clicked a link and found yourself here, wherever here may be, reading this story. And to be honest, I don't care if you believe me or not. Even if you do, it probably won't stop you from trying to uncover the truth of a darkness that few of us have ever seen. It certainly never stopped Zimmerman. If you want a lesson, look at what happened to him when he went seeking the truth. I pray that none of you will ever discover this truth. I pray that none of you ever have to see the evil I have seen. I hope you all get to live in ignorance of what lies beyond the veil of what we can understand. It's here now. I can feel its black eyes burning into me, just as I could all those years ago. I am as much to blame as Zimmerman is for the monstrosity that is now free to roam the world, even if I was not the one to create it. I'm sorry. Please forgive me.
Chilling tales for dark nights.